I am Wendell B. Harris Jr., and you are listening to the World is Wrong podcast. It was Betty Davis who said, Hollywood is a plantation. Moss Hart said that Hollywood is the most beautiful slave quarters in the world. And, you know, I don't know how much you know about slavery, Andras, but, you know, the slaves do not actually get together and tell the master, Massa, we've decided to plant kumquats this season, not cotton. We just thought we'd let you know. The slaves do not determine the agenda. The slaves carry out the agenda. The slaves produce, but they do not determine anything. And so when Betty Davis says Hollywood is a plantation, and Moss Hart says it's, the most beautiful slave quarters in the world, they are stating that the most visible, seemingly powerful actors, musicians, performers, influencers, they are all slaves. It's very difficult for people to look at Steven Spielberg or Michael Jackson or whoever and think of them as a slave. But they are not determining content. They are carrying out the cotton planting and the cotton harvesting. And, I had made some comments to you previously about Stephen, but I wanted just to make clear that it's not just Stephen regarding not having absolute control over the content that you produce. But, we're talking about the entire history of Hollywood. Not to mention, the current state. When you talk about people like Robin Williams, Paul Robeson, Francis Farmer, Whitney Houston, Judy Garland, these are all humongous stories of control, battling for control, and battling the slave collar that everyone is assigned.
We're here to tell you how the world is wrong. The world is wrong about
Wendell B. Harris
Jr.
Welcome to The World is Wrong, an extremely positive podcast where we celebrate films and film artists the world is wrong about. I am one of your hosts. I am one of your hosts, and my name is Andras Jones.
And I'm one of your hosts, and my name is Brian Connolly.
Brian Connolly. Well, what are we here to do today, Brian?
This is an exciting interview that you've been trying to get for a while, covering an episode that we did like over a year ago, one of the first ones we did, I think.
It's episode number 12.
Wow. Yeah, early on for Chameleon Street.
Yeah.
And you got the writer, director, star, Wendell B. Harris.
Jr.
Junior to talk. And it's just exciting. Like you mentioned it in the episode, but I think it's worth mentioning now that since we recorded, this movie's really kind of gotten into the minds of other film people. I think when we first did it, I was mentioning it to folks, and a lot of them, all of them, didn't know what I was talking about. But now it's playing at festivals, and it's coming out, and he's getting interviewed and talked, and the movie's getting talked about. Finally,
Yes.
30 some years later. So it's fantastic.
Let's hope it's not too little, even though it is definitely too late. And
Yeah.
people who are not familiar with it and haven't listened to that episode, Chameleon Street won the Grand Jury Prize at the Sundance Film Festival in 1989. But unlike the previous year's winner, Steven Soderbergh's Sex, Lies, and Videotape, Hollywood didn't welcome and embrace Wendell or his film. And over the years, it's emerged that Wendell Harris and Chameleon Street were the target of a campaign to silence them and to keep the film out of wide distribution and to keep the film's writer, director, and star from making more movies in Hollywood. In fact, it appears his only ally in Hollywood, real ally, has been Steven Soderbergh, who cast Wendell in the film Out of Sight. And for the past decades, Wendell has been living in Flint, Michigan, and working on his follow-up film, an ambitious documentary called Yeshua versus Frankenstein in 3D G-Speak, that we discuss at length in the interview. And if the name sounds daunting, it is actually a very exciting and interesting film, and it sounds like Wendell is getting close to finishing it. But we talk about that in this interview.
Great.
And you've heard it, Brian. And
Yeah.
Do you have anything to say to get the listeners ready for it?
This just will also work as one of those great soothing, like when people look up on YouTube just sounds of people doing sounds to calm them. The sound of his voice is beautiful. To hear it for 3 hours, I'm game. He has one of the great voices, one of the great movie voices. And this is an interview that takes you all over the place, and you learn a lot about a person that is not really talked about or interviewed a bunch. So this is very, very exciting, and I'm very excited for anyone to listen to this.
We recorded 2 very long sessions. We've edited those down to what is now probably more like a 4-hour podcast, Brian. And and like you said, it goes into some really excellent places, and yeah, just getting to spend time with that voice is a joy. So let's play the trailer from Chameleon Street and then go into that conversation.
Great.
There might be spoilers. There might be spoilers. There might be spoilers.
Some people call me Mr. Wonderful. Other people call me William Douglas Street, Jr. Born in a log cabin in the backwoods of Kentucky, young Douglas soon elevated himself from field hand to tiger, from tiger to reporter, and from reporter to doctor, from doctor to co-ed, from co-ed to attorney, from attorney to congressman. When I meet somebody, I know within the first 2 minutes who they want me to be. I need some money.
Make some money.
I mean, I could sit here and make you think you're a genius for correctly analyzing this complex, exotic, notorious Negro. You know that the white man runs this world? I'm a victim of 400 years of conditioning.
Your credentials are just too amazing to believe.
What would you concoct such a licentious, low-down lie?
I wanted to get the money.
Open your mouth.
This is all just a vacation to you, isn't it?
Prison, a vacation. And people ask me if I regret what happened. Sure, I regret it, but you can take my word for it. It's an unforgettable experience. I think, therefore I scan. I know not what I am. I am Chameleon Street.
Perhaps I should wait until you start recording. You mentioned yesterday that your former management client and current friend Skinner Myers, who is a very great filmmaker, I hear. What exactly does Skinner Myers have to do with the question regarding Hollywood silencing filmmakers?
Only in that he was the one who turned me on to your film, and that was before I'd ever seen your film. The story he told me was of this great filmmaker I'd never heard of from my generation who won the Sundance Grand Prize for his film and then never got to make another film. And, you know, when you introduce someone to an artist or something, you give them the sort of the short form, like, this is why I think they're great. And then that becomes your story about them. But then when you actually have a chance to talk to that person, rather than to come at it and be like, I know your story, you were silenced by Hollywood. Maybe you have a different take on that story. Maybe your story is different. And I didn't want to just jump in here with me projecting onto you what that story meant, instead of saying, hey, is that your story? What is your story? So, and because Skinner talked on, we interviewed him. He was one of the people who participated in the episode about you. Since we've already sort of represented that story on our podcast, I wanted to give you an opportunity to speak to it, clarify it, challenge it.
So when you say, quote, how do you tell your Hollywood story, unquote, you're asking what exactly, Andras?
I guess I'm asking, when you tell people, so I'll just give you my background. So I moved out to Hollywood when I was 18, and I was lucky enough to find myself all of a sudden meeting a manager and going out on lots of auditions. And I was in one of the Nightmare on Elm Street movies, and it was big business. And I really didn't have anyone around me sort of helping me to understand how the business works. And I made some dumb decisions, or maybe decisions I thought were integrity decisions. And now I don't really work in that side of the film business anymore. And that's a story that I've told in different lengths and in different detail throughout my life since that happened. To me as a young person, it's defined who I am in a lot of ways. And so that would be like my short version of my Hollywood story. So what I'm looking for from you is like, how do you go from being a young artist who is not working in Hollywood to making a film that gets all of this attention? And then I'm sure you had lots of meetings, and yeah, again, this is where I'm saying I'm sure, I don't know, but something happened something happens in the life of a filmmaker or a film artist when they interact with the business that is Hollywood that determines whether or not you make more movies or whether you do something else, or whether you make movies on your own as opposed to inside of that system. So I don't know, that's a long answer. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah. I was just thinking as you were talking that one thing about filmmaking, which I guess you could say is an unforgiving foundation stone, but one thing about filmmaking, it's so expensive. And if you don't make a profit, it's very difficult to keep moving.
Yeah.
But dear Lord, Andras,
well,
that question is so open-ended that I'm having a hard time as we speak trying to get my edit together on what to say, because it's such a long, drawn-out, protracted story that to answer it swiftly is what I'd like to do. I first went out to Hollywood pretty much immediately after graduating from Juilliard in 76. I went out there in 77, mainly because I was hoping to get a job as a writer on the Mary Hartman Mary Hartman television show.
Awesome.
So that's what that was my game plan. And when I got out there and submitted my work to, I even recall the guy's name, Tom Ian. They thanked me and they liked the writing and blah blah blah, but they did not hire me. And I got a job working in downtown Hollywood at Pickwick Bookstore, which 20 years later became B. Dalton Bookstore, but in 77 it was Pickwick Books, and I worked there for 2 years while auditioning constantly and sustaining myself with that bookseller job. In that bookstore, by the way, I ended up working for almost 2 years, and Andras, it's just amazing the people that I met there. I met Orson Welles.
Oh, wow.
I met Sylvester Stallone at the very peak of his first fame garnered from Rocky. I could go on and on. It was just a great job. But after a year and a half there, I did not seem to be making any progress in terms of filmmaking and acting in film. So I went back to Flint, Michigan, and that's when, with my family, we formed an audio-video studio called Prismatic Images. And the point of the studio was to make feature films, but also to videotape weddings and conferences and doing TV commercials and radio shows and radio programming. And that began in 1979. And that essentially is my first dealing with Hollywood, because after I returned to Flint, Michigan and began that studio with my family, that is what led to Chameleon Street.
And would that have been, 79, 80?
Say it again?
Would that be the timeline that you would have moved back to Flint in 79, 80?
Right.
Got it.
I moved back to Flint in 79, immediately proceeded to have a nervous breakdown by going to Detroit with a film crew to make a independent film in Manhattan. And unfortunately, I took a film crew and film equipment to Manhattan and an idea of what we were going to shoot, but I didn't take any budget. So there was no money. We were stranded in Manhattan and we couldn't shoot. And I proceeded to have a nervous breakdown and came back to Flint, Michigan, and focused on the audio video studio for the next 5 years, until I read that interview of Doug Street in the Detroit News in the spring of 1985. So there's your first scoop, Andras. I have never told anybody about that film experience in Manhattan. Good God.
Well, can I ask you a question about what was the film that you were trying to make there?
Well, in my mind, it was essentially going to be a film that was shot and improvised on the location. So I had Godard in my mind,
mm-hmm.
and it was going to be a very political, racial, and socio-political piece that we would improvise throughout Manhattan and shoot like a kind of ongoing "you are there." That was the thinking. But as I said, filmmaking, even the smallest film costs big bucks.
Yeah. And Manhattan is not the cheapest place to go to make a movie.
No.
So you've made your first attempt at making a film in Manhattan. It didn't go the way you wanted, but as I think every filmmaker has a story where they're like, I needed to make all the mistakes I made on my first one so that I could do the second one. And the second one for you is Chameleon Street. So can you talk about your process of having the realization that Douglas Street's story was one you wanted to make into a movie and how you went about doing that?
Well, I'll tell you, it was a very quick process, my friend, very quick. I am sitting at around 8 p.m. in the evening in my parents' den with the TV on in the background. I'm reading through the Detroit News, sitting there on the couch, and I read an article devoted to Doug Street and his entire exploits up until that point. And the process, as you ask, was immediate in terms of me recognizing that Doug's story and his attitude and his exploits were gold as far as film narrative. And, Andras, I've been very frank about what was going on. I was very much looking for a part to play. And as I have said in the past, I was working on a couple other projects that I hoped would end up being filmed. One was a remake of Nightmare Alley. Another was, yeah.
Oh, wow. Okay.
You should read that Criterion Top 10 because I talk about that. It's one of my top 10. And I talk about how, only reading about Doug Street stopped me plodding ahead on a Nightmare Alley remake. And I was still kind of fiddling about, thinking about a production of Victor Hugo's The Man Who Laughs. That was also, I was puttering around with that. But the moment that I read about Doug Street, all of that was swept aside. And it was so obvious that, number one, playing him would be an absolute honor and joy, and that the actual narrative would be very revealing of this country from a color and class standpoint.
So you have this idea and you have this production company, and do you just go into production, or are you raising money? How do you go from initial idea to we're shooting this thing? I guess you had to write a screenplay first.
Right. And, don't leave out all of the, I guess you'd call it grunt work that was going on between 1980 and 1985 when I read that article, because during that time, you know, you're also earning a living by shooting everything from, you know, weddings to conferences to TV commercials, radio commercials, on and on. And that is, of course, extremely valuable, and simultaneously looking for what the first feature film would be based on. That was all going on for that, you know, those first 5 years. But after settling on Doug Street as a story, then it became an issue of writing the script and raising the money. They kind of go hand in hand, and you have to start writing immediately, because when you're going to people and asking for money, you've got to show them something on paper. So, you know, that's when you start writing endless outlines and endless synopsis and endless treatments in order to entice potential investors. And one thing that I need to also make clear is that the reason it took 3 years to write the script, and the reason there were 36 different drafts, is because it took 3 years to raise the money. You know, if we had had the money in place after the first year, I was ready to go with a script, a finished script, after the first year. But we didn't have the money. There was, you know, endless meetings.
Mm.
My mother, Helen Harris, who was the executive producer, and we had endless meetings with potential investors. And, you know, as I've often said, raising the money for Chameleon Street was like scraping dried blood off of the sidewalk with a butter knife.
And did you end up getting the funding from one source, or from sort of cobbling it together from multiple sources?
Multiple sources. But it should also be stated that the $1.5 million budget breaks down as follows. $585,000 from my parents. They invested $585,000. My brother Hobart invested $120,000. And the remainder were Black investors. Although we did have 4 white investors, but that came to about $95,000. The point being that the money essentially was Black money. And
from Michigan? All from Michigan, pretty much?
Yep. And, you know, I've also made the point that independent film is independent because of independent thought and independent money. You've got to have independent money.
So you get your budget together, and I imagine through all this time, you're also casting it in your mind. Like, how did you put, it seems like most of these people who are in this film for the most part, were not people that, I mean, when I look at IMDb, most of the cast isn't even listed on there. And the ones who do don't have extensive credits. So how did you go about casting this film? Were these people you knew? Were they people you just hired a casting director and had auditions? How did you go about that?
Well, we had all of that. There was the hiring of Ruth Birch, Burch. She was a very well-known casting director. She did a lot of the casting for films and TV in the 50s and 60s. So when I met her and engaged her, she helped us in terms of getting our casting. But the casting of Chameleon Street is a very complex, somewhat tortured story. And you can go from specifics, which is the only way to do it. Just off the top of my head, for example, I'm thinking about all of the actors that we contacted for the role of Gabrielle Street. That was more agonizing and torturous and protracted than the search for Vivian Lee to play Scarlett O'Hara. We approached Oprah Winfrey. We approached LaToya Jackson, Kathy Tyson, the great Kathy Tyson from Mona Lisa, and also Attila Shabazz, the daughter of Malcolm X. And for various reasons, none of those worked out. So,
are you telling me that Oprah chose The Color Purple over Chameleon Street?
Listen, since you have a way of asking very pertinent questions that nobody else has ever asked before, let me just say that of all the people that we contacted, the only person that we could not get through to was Oprah Winfrey. I could not get through to Oprah for them to even accept the script. And she's the only one in my life that I've ever had been blocked from contacting.
Wow.
LaToya Jackson didn't work out because her father, he wanted so much money, Joe Jackson, that we just couldn't afford her. Attila Shabazz, the beautiful, brilliant Attila Shabazz, she would have been a great Gabrielle, but she turned it down. She turned it down. And we couldn't afford Kathy Tyson ultimately. The part of the psychiatrist, Dr. Hand, who opens the film actually, that was written for Brother Theodore.
Oh.
And Ruth Birch had contacted him for us. And there was some conflict. We couldn't get him, although he was favorable to doing it. But that's the casting that got away, Brother Theodore. But he would have been great, though.
Yeah.
But he would not have been. It was going to be very, very restrained. Not the wild man screaming, but extremely restrained, like that was the way I wanted him to play the part. But ultimately, the part was played by David Kiley, who is the son of Richard Kiley. And David Kiley was absolutely great.
Yeah, that opening scene is great. And I have to say, while I would be curious to see any of those actresses you mentioned playing the role, the person you did get to play, Gabrielle Street, she's awesome in this film. She's fantastic in this movie. And that's Angela Leslie.
Yeah, she's extraordinary. Extraordinary.
Did you first meet her in a casting session? Did you see her on tape? What was when you auditioned her, did you know that she was the one?
When I first auditioned Angela, what struck me about her immediately, one thing about being a director in film is that, you find out immediately that the great majority of people, when you're shooting them, depending upon how that person is lit, the angle, the entire way the medium wraps itself around the image of the actor, there are favorable, ways you can make people look favorably, enhancing their features, and there are ways you can unenhance their features. And what I'm trying to say poorly is that everybody, for the most part, almost everybody, has a bad angle.
Yeah.
You can shoot them, and even Garbo knew this. Garbo knew that if you shot her a certain way, she looks just like a dachshund. And that's why she kept William Daniels with her for her entire career. Well, I noticed when auditioning Angela that she looks incredibly beautiful no matter what angle. And there are very few that you can say that about.
And yet, rewatching it last night, you can see there are times when, as a filmmaker, you're trying to show her in a more negative light. And I think that's one of the things that's really great about that performance is I think she's. Do you consider her to be the villain of Douglas Street's story? It seems like she is, if not the villain, at least to some degree, his nemesis. That's at least what I got. And when I watched the film, I just found myself still liking her, even though she is portrayed in a lot of negative ways.
Well, the thing about Chameleon Street, which I'm sure you're aware of, it's all Doug's story. It's not a well-rounded, well-researched, there is no input from anyone except Doug Street. It's all his story. And many of the lines are verbatim from the lips of Doug Street. So when Doug tells his story, Andras, as far as Doug is concerned, at the moment of his arrest, yeah, she is the enemy. Yeah, she is the one who has betrayed him. It's like that is his subjective take on it. But as you know, Doug Street has spent the entire film betraying any number of relationships,
Yeah.
not the least of which would be Gabrielle, number one. And that entire relationship with Amina Tatiana, that's an adulterous affair, and that's a betrayal. So that's the trajectory of his narrative. And I don't think that, I don't know, are you saying that you think Gabrielle is the problem, the enemy of Doug Street that brings him down?
Well, it's more that from the very beginning of the film, that great scene when he's talking in the van about the money moon, and then about all of his first wife and his second wife both having this refrain of make some money, that at least in the world of the film, the pressure to make money is to please these women in his life, and it's their demanding that he make money that pushes him into this life of crime. And of course, at the end, at the end, she is the betrayer. Gabrielle is the betrayer.
Right.
So in a broader sense, you could look at the film as being that capitalism and racism are the enemies to Doug Street's progression in the world. But it's personalized in the film in the women in Doug Street's life who are hungry for this money. You get the sense that Douglas Street would be happy to just read books and listen to music if the women in his life weren't demanding that he make a lot of money. Is that accurate? I mean, at least to Doug Street's story?
Well, actually, I'm not sure if it's inaccurate, but I think it's a little bit off the point.
Well, please get me back on the point. Correct me. This is to get your vision of it. How do you see those dynamics?
Well, I mean, Andras, how can you actually say that Gabrielle has betrayed Doug when the entire relationship between Doug, not to mention the daughter, Doug and his wife and daughter, Doug and the marriage covenant, Doug and monogamy. I mean, Doug has, on every level, including bringing money into the situation, but on every level, he has gone his own way and betrayed whatever there is to be betrayed. So if you are building on a house of betrayal, how can you lay the blame at the feet of Gabrielle?
And I think that's what I experienced, again, rewatching it last night, was that I find myself, even though the hero of the film I'm watching, which is Doug Street, even though he keeps telling me that Gabrielle is making demands of him that are unreasonable, and she smacks him around, and the film has her do some, ultimately betray him and inform on him to the cops, and yet I do find myself at the end of the film still liking her, not disliking the hero, but just sort of being caught in this dynamic of like, okay, well, the film says that she's doing all these dastardly things, but the performance, and maybe the film is doing something more subversive and actually setting her up as a kind of hero without a voice. Because as you say, this is Doug Street's story, and he's the voice. But you're right. His actions are betrayals at every level. And I mean, he's a con man, and she's a woman trying to deal with being married to a con man.
That's right. And, you know, the entire issue of having a wife and a child, I mean, you've got to do something. You are accountable. And anyway,
I am kind of curious. Is this the way? I mean, what I hear from you is an adult man's view of this situation. You've lived a life. You have a certain amount of maturity. I'm curious, when you were making the film as a young man, did you feel the same way, or has your relationship to the characters in your film changed as you've grown?
No. It was all laid out when we made the film, who was betraying whom.
Got it.
And what was being betrayed. And although you haven't asked about it, nobody has ever asked about it, actually. But, you know, the relationship between Doug and Gabrielle, which is exacerbated by, at one point, she decides to become a Jehovah's Witness, and they had been nominal, but they had been Baptist prior to her becoming a Jehovah's Witness. That
is the line, who gets tired of being a Baptist? Is that the line from the film that Doug Street says in the voiceover?
How can you get tired of being a Baptist? That's what he says.
That's a great line.
Yes, it is. But, you know, that point about how they have no agreement in terms of how to raise the child, how to bring money into the situation. I mean, you have to have money in order to buy chicken, to feed yourself. You have to have money. You have to have money to clothe the child. Gabrielle and Doug are dependent upon each other, and that was crystal clear when we made the film, and it's crystal clear now. And you know, Doug was as honest. He was honest enough to recognize that he had betrayed, you know, right and left in his various quote unquote escapades.
Yeah. I have lots more questions about the film, and I want to get into those. But I also am curious. Can we just jump forward for a second? So you make this movie. It's finished. Again, I have lots of more questions, but just about the film. But once it's finished, the next thing that I'm aware of in the story is it goes to Sundance and it wins the grand jury prize. It's the grand jury prize, right? Or it won the main film award at Sundance in, was it 89 or 90? Which year was it?
January 1990, the grand jury prize.
Right. So that's a very prestigious award, maybe more like that was at the beginning of Sundance. But how do you go from making this movie, finishing it, to getting it to Sundance and it winning the award? Can you walk me through that?
How do I go from what to what?
How do you go from I finished this independent movie funded in Michigan with family and friends' money to going to Sundance and winning this award?
Well, the first thing you do is you get on the festival circuit. And in the autumn of 1989, that's exactly what we did. We submitted the film to Venice and Toronto and Telluride and, gosh, I'm leaving out one. Oh, Cannes. Cannes turned us down. Telluride turned us down. The film was shown in Toronto and in Venice, and it was submitted to Sundance and accepted. Like the year before at Sundance, Steven Soderbergh won for Sex, Lies, and Videotape. Now, I think before Steven even left Park City, he had a distribution deal. Chameleon Street did not get a distribution deal for another year. We did not actually get distributed until Northern Arts, a distributor out of Massachusetts, picked us up, and we were distributed for about 6 weeks in the spring of 1991.
I feel like there's a lot unsaid and implied in that story. Then I'd like to dig into it a little bit. So you're at Sundance. You're aware that winning the grand jury prize has a history of leading to an immediate embrace from Hollywood and the commercial, the commercial entities that fund it, the distribution channels. Right. And you're there and you're waiting, you're like, okay, where's my distribution deal? What did you have an awareness during that Sundance that your experience was different than than previous winners?
Well, not really. That would come a few weeks later, a few weeks and years later. Mm-hmm. But at that very moment, what you're asking, Andras, I was satisfied to get, the award and a bottle of Dom Perignon sent to my chateau that night by Alan J. Pakula with a very warm and gracious and encouraging note. And I didn't feel, even though I didn't have a distribution deal, everybody seemed so excited and so enthusiastic that I said, well, I'll get the distribution deal next week in Hollywood. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, well, it does, and it leads to the next question, which is, okay, so it's the next week in Hollywood. There isn't a distribution deal forthcoming, but are there calls? Are there meetings? Are you going around to the studios and pitching your next project? What are you doing?
Yeah, but that's part of the problem. That's part of the problem, actually, because it would be, in fact, this has all been documented by Elvis Mitchell, who interviewed me, and on video, I was being shot as he informed me that Chameleon Street was being suppressed and that I was being waylaid and distracted and marginalized in Hollywood. But I'm sorry, your question again was?
Well, okay, you're getting to it. So it's the week after or the weeks after you've won this award.
Right.
And yeah, I'm just curious. So when was the Elvis Mitchell interview?
That was like in March or April of 1990. So that would be about 4 or 5 months. Maybe it was June. But anyway, it was after January 1990 when we win the award. I move out there in March. I moved to Hollywood in March. And immediately, I'm inundated with all the meetings with all the head production companies in Hollywood. That is, I've always said, that is the main prize. Yeah, you get this wonderful statue crystal prize when you win the grand jury prize, but the real prize is you get access to every major production company in Hollywood. So I had all these meetings that I was constantly going to and thinking, of course, that distribution for Chameleon Street would be interlaced with all these meetings. I mean, I'm going to meetings with everybody who is anybody in Hollywood. Barry Levinson, Spielberg, Cher's company, Jane Fonda. I mean, none of those people actually met with me, just their staff.
Right.
The only people who actually met with me face to face was Mel Brooks, Jerry Weintraub, and Ed Pressman. Everybody else, it was their people.
Wow, that's okay. Those are some good folks. It's Mel Brooks. How was the meeting with Mel Brooks?
Let me just say that in the first 48 seconds of our meeting, when he stuck his head into the conference room, in 48 seconds, Andras, I understood why the great Mel Brooks had been almost thrown out of a window by Sid Caesar in the 1950s during a writers' meeting for your show of shows.
What did he do?
I can't tell you what he said. All I can say is I understood immediately why Sid Caesar almost threw him out of a window.
Okay. I wish I wish I was a fly on the wall there, so you wouldn't have to tell me, but I'd know. Now we can I'll just imagine. And I'm curious. It's just a weird synchronicity. A director that I've been working with, who I met through this podcast, named Paul Williams, not the singer or the writer for Crawdaddy magazine or the architect, but the other Paul Williams, the filmmaker. And he was partners with Ed Pressman. Pressman Williams was their company for many years. And so I'm just curious because I've thought more about Edward Pressman in the last year than ever before. And in talking with Paul, I'm curious how that meeting went.
Boy, you have a way of asking questions of very interesting moments, because my meeting with Ed Pressman was then and now unprecedented. I brought to the meeting my brother, Hobart Harris, the film's composer, Peter Moore, and an Australian filmmaker producer whose name I have forgotten, but I had just met him 2 days before at a meeting in Hollywood. And for whatever reason, I decided it would be great if he came to this meeting I had with Ed Pressman. That turned out to be a big mistake. This guy, well, anyway, I ended up wishing I had never brought the guy to the meeting with Ed Pressman. And Ed Pressman kept asking me about a project that I had pitched to him regarding the life story of Alexander Pushkin, the great Russian writer who is the acknowledged Shakespeare of Russia. And of course, he's also Black. And so Pressman kept asking me, how much would the budget be for a film about Alexander Pushkin? And I had not worked it out. So I kept trying to dodge that question, but he finally jacked me up against the wall and made me answer it. So I said 20 million.
That's exactly the number I was thinking. Great. Okay. Yeah. And what did he say?
Back in 1991, 20 million was a little bit more than it is today.
Yeah.
In any case, Ed Pressman thought it was totally absurd. And that ended the meeting.
Did you have someone in mind who you wanted to play Pushkin?
Yeah, the same guy that had played it on stage in a one-man show throughout prisons and in Flint, Wendell B. Harris Jr.
Ah, I've heard of this actor. He's pretty good in the film Chameleon Street.
Well,
wait, you didn't. What? How did the Australian guy ruin the meeting? You sort of left that Chekhov's gun on the mantle.
He had really impressed me as a very creative and balanced individual the day before when I met him at the party. So I was somewhat surprised that when we got into the meeting, he just all of a sudden started speaking. I mean, I don't recall the exact things that he was saying, but they were totally off the wall, off point, sometimes off color, and totally spurious. And gosh, I remember we all went to a restaurant after the meeting, and Lord have mercy, I laid into him, but it extremely, extremely quietly. My mother always taught me that when you really have something to say to someone, and especially if you're angry with them, make sure you speak very low and very softly and very sweetly. And I spoke so softly and sweetly to this Australian that he melted into a puddle.
I'm loving getting you're telling these stories because, again, as I told you, I heard your story before I saw the film. And then when I saw the film Chameleon Street, there are a couple of scenes where Doug Street's in meetings with figures of authority, whether it's with the lawyers or with the prison doctor. And I can't help but imagine, and maybe this is incorrect, that that's you talking to Hollywood. That you're sitting across a desk from these people who are, who don't understand you or don't get the project, and you know what you're doing. You know that you just won this award. You know that your distribution deal is coming, and I'm just curious, when you had these meetings with these people, did you ever feel some connection to those scenes from Chameleon Street?
Well, the thing about Chameleon Street is that it delves with the interaction between blacks and whites in the American culture, which is so stratified by race. And it takes those stratifications and, plucks them like the strings of a harp. So, yes, everything that takes place in Chameleon Street is so interlaced with the interaction between blacks and whites in this country that you can't help but find reverberations. Wherever you go.
Yeah. Yeah. So, okay, so you're having these meetings mostly with people's assistants, occasionally meeting with the actual power players. Still so curious about that Mel Brooks meeting, but I'm just going to let it go. And then you have this interview with Elvis Mitchell. What do you find out in that about the ways that you are being sandbagged?
Well, up until that interview by Elvis Mitchell, I had been thinking that I was, playing the Hollywood casino, that I was there working towards some end that would culminate in a deal for my next feature. And instead, after, during that interview, right there on camera, Elvis tells me, he's off camera, I'm on camera, and Elvis tells me something which the moment he says it, I understand that he's exactly right. That's what's happening. Not what I thought, that I was playing the Hollywood game, that people were actually interested in what my next feature would be or what the next job would be. No, it was quite the opposite. And yet, having said all that, I'll also say that, because I've been leaving this out and I shouldn't, Jerry Weintraub is the only one who actually had the guts to actually hire me. And I worked for him for almost 2 years on a script. And I should tell you that because, in telling this whole Hollywood story, how Hollywood abused Wendell and how Hollywood ignored Wendell and all of that. And they did, but they also hired Wendell. So did Showtime, to write scripts. And while I was there for 3 years, I learned something about Hollywood, which I had not really been aware of. And that is, Andras, you can earn a living in Hollywood in filmmaking and never actually make a film.
Yeah.
I didn't know that until I was out there for 3 years. And then I met people who were involved in planning and producing and proposing and pushing, but never actually making the finished product. You could actually make money and sustain yourself, and yet not actually end up producing anything. That's kind of an amazing phenomenon, but it's real.
Oh yeah, I feel like a film like Barton Fink, that's where that lives. This weird purgatory of Hollywood where you're in the system, you're as if you were happy to just get a paycheck and hang out with famous people, Hollywood could be a really sort of easy place if you get into it, if you manage to work your way into it. But if you actually want to make things, if you actually have a vision of what you'd like to make, it gets much more difficult.
Well, that is the crux of it. What you just said. If you want to be part of the team that is aiding them in whatever they are producing, then you can work forever and be paid very well. But the moment that you start submitting content, because it's a war over content. You know, it's not a war over production. It's a war over content.
Yes, that's a mouthful right there. That's the crux of it. Yes. So you had this moment where you realized that what you thought was going on in terms of your being welcomed into the film business was actually the opposite. And yet you say you did get hired for some jobs. So you stayed in Hollywood for a few more years. How long is this chapter of the story? How long were you in Hollywood?
3 years.
So that gets us to like 94?
Yeah.
And is there any part of what you were doing there, the things you were writing, that you look back on and think, God, I wish that had gotten made. I was really happy with that.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Everything I worked on, I wish had been made. You know, during that period, I wrote a feature script based on the life of Joe Louis called The Brown Bomber. And that was written not for a Hollywood studio, but for the Joe Louis Barrow family. And they were extremely interested in Spike Lee directing it. But I just wrote the script. And then I wrote a script on spec and shopped it around called Negropolis. Negropolis is a ancient Rome satire based on the conceit that all of the emperors and most of the senators and ruling class are black, and all the slaves are white. And the emperor, whose name is Caligula, that's spelled C-A-N as in Nancy, I-G-U-L-A.
Yeah.
Caligula is the emperor. And
let's make this now. Can we just make this now?
Yes, and Alexander the Great is played by Howard Stern in a long blonde wig, and he's Jewish. Alexander the Great is Jewish with blonde hair. And Oprah Winfrey was written the part of Cleopatra. And Cleopatra is this corporate genius who has manufactured a line of Cleo makeup products and also has incorporated a line of different Cleopatras who impersonate her in various countries. And
this seems like something that someone else could It's like it's laying there. This is something right there, laying there on the ground. Anyone could take and run with and make into what it could be. And there's such a dearth of ideas, and so many people out there trying to. I feel like who would want something like a film like that right now? I don't know.
It's funny as you say that. I'm reminded of this one scene in Negropolis where the emperor Caligula decides, he is constantly doing these out of the box, mad, insane things. And one thing he does is he will banish a letter or change a letter from one thing to another. Like for all of the German vassals that he is emperor over, one day he capriciously decides that the German alphabet will no longer have a G, that all the G's in the German language will be now replaced by V, as in Victor. So that now, instead of referring to a German, you are referring to a vermin. And it's no longer Germany, it's verminy. So that, as you were talking, I was thinking about that.
It is a comedy.
Yes.
God.
Yes, it is. But it's like Chaplin in The Great Dictator, or Richard Pryor in This Way Is Up, or Sid Caesar in Your Show of Shows, or the great Phil Silvers in Bilko. It's weaponized comedy.
Yeah.
That particular script was, in 1994, was interesting to Spike Lee, who agreed to produce it. And so we negotiated with attorneys for like 4 months. And on the day that we were going to sign the contract, he was on the set of Crooklyn at the moment, and I was here in Flint, or maybe I was in Hollywood. But anyway, on the day that we were supposed to sign the contracts, I asked a question about adding a clause that I would have to sign off on the edit, the final edit. And as soon as Spike was informed, he exploded and called the deal off. So, Negropolis. By the way, speaking of Spike Lee, I wrote a role in Negropolis for Spike's sister, Joie.
Mm-hmm.
And she is the great talent in that family. Oh well.
It's so funny how many. I hear this story not about Spike Lee, but just in. I can't tell you how many times I've talked with people who talk about someone who's like a famous director, movie star person, and then they're like, but his sister is really the talent in that family. And I've heard this like about 2 or 3 other people very recently, and
right.
It just seems like there should be an agency out there just really targeting the sisters of these more successful brothers. That's how they found Julia Roberts, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah.
I couldn't help but be struck by the fact I think about you and Soderbergh. You're linked in my mind, in part because of your appearance in Out of Sight, which I'd love to hear how that came about, and your connection with Sundance. But then when you talk about Negropolis, and I think about his film Schizopolis, first of all, I think what a double feature. I would love to be able to have seen that double feature. But I guess that leads me to, do you feel particularly connected to Soderbergh as a filmmaker?
Oh, yeah. And I got a phone call from Steven. I'm not exactly sure. It must have been like a year before Schizopolis came out. I was still in Hollywood, I think. But anyway, Steven contacted me because, you know, he was aware that I was pushing Negropolis in Hollywood. I pitched it all over the place. And Steven was aware of it. I think he had a copy of my treatment also. Anyway, he called me up one day and said, Wendell, would you mind if I make a movie called Schizopolis, inspired by your title, Negropolis? And I said, of course not. Of course not. And he went on and made Schizopolis, which, between you and me, Andras, it's my favorite Soderbergh film.
You're definitely a sort of the world is wrong kind of artist, because I think Brian, my co-host, and I would fully agree with that as being one of our favorites of his films.
Yeah.
So unique. So I mean, that's one of those. It's one of the ones. Well, can we talk? I don't want to. He's your friend and a colleague, so I don't want to get too into it. But what you're talking about here, singling out that film, it speaks to what sort of what a unique artist he is, in that he has these very particular visions and he figures out how to make them, but he also has figured out how to work very well within that Hollywood system without seeming to give up what makes him Soderbergh.
Well, yeah, Steven has learned. He has definitely learned how to play the Hollywood game, which essentially is to do what they say in terms of the content. You know, before, I had a conversation with Steven in 2002 when it was prior to him actually starting work on Solaris. And he told me, you know, Wendell, I do not want to make this film. And he kept saying that over and over in the conversation. You know, finally I said, well, why are you making it? And then he answered something about, you know, James Cameron wanted him to do it, and whatever the studio was it Fox? Anyway, the studio had just overwhelmed him with, you know, we'll give you all the money in the world to make this science fiction film, Solaris. And for whatever reason, Steven felt that he was being somehow coerced into making Solaris. And the tension in Hollywood is oftentimes connected to being forced into producing content that you are either indifferent to or perhaps even against. You know, I had a conversation with Steven in 1991 out in Hollywood at a dinner, and just in passing, it was not a political conversation, but in passing, he made a very derogatory comment about Che Guevara.
Huh.
And he expressed his great disdain. Although, when Stephen expresses great disdain, you would hardly know it from his facial expression, because he always keeps his facial expression in a kind of a deadpan. But that's how come he can make these great one-liners so hilarious. But about, 10, 12 years later, he ends up making a huge film homage to Che.
2 films.
Well, what?
2 films.
Two.
Yeah.
2. So my only point is that when you're working in Hollywood, you either fall in line and produce what they say, or you get out of Dodge, man.
Yeah. Yeah. I feel like that is like the Hollywood story that we inherit is the Steven Soderbergh story, but the Hollywood story that most of us who have any connection with it experience is more like the Wendell Harris story that you're describing, is coming out to Hollywood, if you manage to have some success, thinking that that's going to mean something, and realizing it only means something if you're willing to buy into something that is the antithesis of what made you make that initial impact in the first place. And It's a rare person who is able to, like, I think that's one of the things that I find respectable about Soderbergh, is that he's managed to do that with enough grace as an artist that I still enjoy watching his films, which is not the case with, as you said, the system. It doesn't really, maybe it's his deadpan nature that allows him to sort of smuggle Steven Soderbergh films into films that he may not even want to make, which, by the way, I've never seen his Solaris, so I don't know about it. But
in 2009, Sex, Lies, and Videotape, along with Chameleon Street, were inducted into the Sundance UCLA archive, and they had both of us come back for that ceremony. And there was a big dinner one night, just exquisite food. And Robert Redford got up to introduce the entire gathering to the event, and he made a few comments. And Stephen was sitting to his left, about 20 feet away. And I watched the interplay between Redford and Soderbergh throughout that evening, which did not last long, because as soon as Redford introduced Stephen, he disappeared immediately. And Stephen got up and made some comments, but Redford was gone. And it just reminded me of the tension between the two of them. Now, like I say, this is 2009, but all throughout the early 90s, Redford was constantly nagging Stephen about not being commercial enough, and that all of his projects smacked of some kind of non-commercial avant-garde art house ethos that was not commercial. But the interesting thing is that in the mid-90s, a project that Stephen was nursing was, well, I don't know how it happened exactly, but Redford ended up directing Quiz Show, and that was Stephen's project.
It feels like a Soderbergh. That's wild. Sorry.
You know, I have often thought, Andras, I've often thought that if Steven had directed Quiz Show, it, that would have ended up being his greatest film. And my only point is that Redford was constantly on Steven's back in the early 90s about being commercial. And that's a lesson which Steven has definitely learned, but it would appear that the price Steven had to pay for that lesson was not directing Quiz Show.
Right.
Anyway, in 2009, I could still feel the tension between them.
Yeah. Doing this work, talking with different filmmakers, you end up learning stories that definitely change your opinion of people you thought were big integrity people. I don't want to go too deeply into it, but we did an episode about the films Thunderheart and Incident at Oglala, about the American Indian movement and Leonard Peltier, right. And Redford narrates Incident at Oglala, so you get the impression that he's very supportive of AIM and of Peltier and of that project. But Michael Apted actually, in an interview close to the end of his life, pretty much says the exact opposite, that Redford was extremely critical of the film and of Peltier and did things to make it so that it was harder to get out. So it's just, again, I don't want to, this isn't to tear down Redford, but also just sort of like to talk to that dynamic of some people accrue to themselves. And I think maybe this is just a Hollywood star thing, that it's a talent to be able to draw the integrity of others to yourself and have it affixed to you as a star, even while at the same time, to some degree undercutting those artists and the causes that you're getting credit for being supportive of. So, and I feel like that sounds like what you're speaking to in the quiz show dynamic.
It was obvious to me, at least, it seemed obvious, still does, that Redford felt a proprietary ownership of Steven to a certain extent, because Steven's career was made at Sundance,
right,
by winning Sex, Lies, and Videotape. So that gave Redford the feeling that, well, I can advise him and criticize him and even take over one of his projects, because after all, he's a child of Sundance.
Right.
Anyway, I was very, initially in 1990, Robert Redford was not at Sundance when, we won. He was away out of the country shooting Havana, directed by Sidney Pollack. So I didn't meet him in 1990. But in 2009, Jeffrey Gilmore was very gracious and arranged a quick meeting between myself and Robert Redford. And all I said to him was, can you help me get Chameleon Street on the Sundance Channel? I want you to know that for the 30 years Chameleon Street or the 25 years that Chameleon Street has been suppressed, I have done everything humanly possible, contacted every influential individual I had, from Robert Redford to Steven Soderbergh to all kinds of people, have attempted to assist me in breaking the Chameleon Street broadcast ban. And no one, not Steven Soderbergh, God bless him, not Robert Redford, God bless him, and no one else has been able to break that broadcast ban. And he told me in response that, for my request to get the film on Sundance Channel, that he had sold the channel to another corporation and he had nothing to say anymore about. He had no power, he said. So I just wanted to add that because, you may be laboring under the same, even a little bit, the same conundrum that I labored under, and that the public does labor under. We look at Hollywood and the people who work there as having the power. Andras, they do not have the power. They are the slaves who implement what the power says. And, we can't understand that. We think Steven Spielberg has ultimate power. Listen, if anybody had ultimate power in entertainment, that person would have been Michael Jackson. Michael Jackson is a filmmaker, and yet he could not get his props in Hollywood. Instead of playing Peter Pan like he should have for Spielberg, Robin Williams played Peter Pan. And Robin told me even he thought that Michael should have played it. So I'm just saying that you can talk to all the Robert Redfords you want, but that's not where the power is.
So, okay, so I feel like we're now moving into whatever the next chapter is after you. Was there a moment that made you realize I need to leave Hollywood and go back to Michigan?
Yeah. That third year, I remember that the initial glow from January 1990 finally evaporated into the ether by 1993, 94 in Hollywood. It was clear after 3 years and after people like Elvis Mitchell and Armand White helping me understand the dynamic, it was clear that I was not going to be supported in Hollywood. And I suppose you've heard of that joke which was going around during that, during that 3 years. That was the early 90s when Black film directors were seemingly sought after and rewarded by Hollywood deals. And there was that saying that went around Hollywood: all you have to do to get a good production deal in Hollywood is be Black, male, and not Wendell Harris.
I had not heard that joke. But it's not a fun one to be the punchline of.
So, after 3 years and that kind of input, you get the impression that it's time to leave. And I often remember that when I left Hollywood in 1994, I guess, I remember feeling like, man, you're leaving Hollywood with your tail between your legs. They have whipped you into some kind of exit. The funny thing about Hollywood, which Hal Holbrook, who just died recently, Hal Holbrook's wife, Dixie Carter, she said it best, that the difference between New York and Hollywood is that in New York, they're very blunt, sometimes brusque, but upfront about, you know, whatever business dealings you're engaged in. But she said in Hollywood, you can go to a meeting or you can go to 10 meetings and you think that everything has gone great in that meeting, that they love you, they support you, that everything that is going to happen. And then you leave you leave the meeting and you stop into a grocery store to pick up a quart of milk. And as you bend over to pick up the milk, your head falls off because it was cut off in that meeting and you never knew it.
Yeah. I wonder, so just my orientation, my family are political activists to some degree, especially in earlier generations. My grandfather was a communist lawyer who fought against on the lynching in the South and led to my grandfather being called before HUAC. So my point is that my orientation towards Hollywood is very aware of the blacklist and HUAC. And when I hear stories like that, I feel like there's something about the vestiges of that kind of sort of doublespeak and duplicity that was a survival mechanism that was built into the industry, that like the people who succeeded in the industry were the people who could do that, who could meet with you and smile to your face and then inform on you to the FBI behind your back and destroy your career, all without you ever knowing that was what they were doing. I don't know if there's, do you have any, you don't have to have an appointment. That's definitely my own perspective.
Yeah. Oh yeah. And as you were speaking, I don't know why my mind went to it, but my mind went to the early 40s, 1940 or 41. The history of this country has been that there have always been some whites who have actually tried to help Black people in our situation. In 1940 or 41, there was some white guy, I don't know what his name is, but he knew Chester Himes. And he was a great admirer of Chester Himes' writing. So he tried to get him a job at Warner Brothers and actually got Chester Himes on the lot for about a week until Jack Warner heard that Chester Himes was on the property. Jack Warner immediately sent security and a note to whoever was in charge of security to immediately go and escort Chester Himes off the Warner Brothers lot because I don't want, quote, I don't want no niggers on this lot, unquote. And my mind boggles at the thought of Chester Himes writing scripts, screenplays for Warner Brothers in the 40s. Oh. But
yeah, when you mentioned the Chester Himes on the Warner Brothers lot story, it made me think of the Jackie Robinson auditioning for the Red Sox story. Are you familiar with this?
No.
In 1945, so 2 years before he would begin desegregating baseball with the Brooklyn Dodgers, an integrationist paper and journalist waged a campaign to force the Red Sox to audition 3 Negro League players, one of whom was Jackie Robinson. And the story goes that Tom Yawkey, the Red Sox owner, who had been a good friend of Ty Cobb's and was a very an unapologetic racist, came out and shouted basically what Jack Warner said about Chester Himes 2 years earlier.
Right.
I don't want those N-words on my field. Get those N-words off my field.
I really think it's important to quote Jack Warner exactly.
You can.
Quote, "I don't want no niggers on this lot," unquote. You know, it's so amazing to me how racism makes you stupid.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
and
imagine how the Red Sox would have done if they had signed Jackie Robinson in 1945. Didn't win a World Series until 2004, guys. So, okay, sorry, go on.
That was the Red Sox.
Yeah.
Gosh, I thought it was the Cubs.
No, and I grew up as a Red Sox fan, so it's one of those things of realizing that you've been...
Yeah, I know what you mean, yeah.
And I guess, would you mind, just because I again, vaguely aware of Chester Himes. When you mentioned him, I did more research, and then we did an episode about an HBO series that was made in the early 90s called Cosmic Slop, where they did a Chester Himes short story as one of the 3 segments in an episode called Tang, about this couple who's in their apartment and a gun is delivered to their door and said, wait for the uprising. So I'm just curious, could you talk a little bit about Chester Himes?
In the summer of 1981, in somewhere near you on the West Coast, on a beachfront property that was owned, probably still is owned, by the great Black writer Ishmael Reed. And my mother, Helen, and myself were privileged to actually conduct and record not only Ishmael Reed, whom we were there for, but at the same time, Chester and Leslie Himes were there visiting Ishmael Reed.
Wow.
So we got the final interview of Chester Himes, which was a great honor, of course. A great honor. It was after his final stroke, and Leslie, his wife, she had to interpret a lot of what Chester Himes said, but he was still the great Chester Himes.
Do you have any particular memories of things that you learned about him during that time, or just things you think are important for people to know about Chester Himes who might not be aware of him?
Well, you know, Andras, when you meet somebody who is in their mid-80s and they're confined to a wheelchair and they have a very difficult time speaking, every syllable is an effort, and they have accomplished in their life the most articulate, profound, dramatic. I mean, Chester Himes' writing is off the chain and off the charts. When I think of the great writers, I think of Chester Himes first. And to see the intellect, and I mean, this amazing intellect, this amazing writer at the end of his life, forcing his thoughts and emotions through his disabled body. That is a lesson and an example which is difficult to put into words.
Yeah. I think anyone who's had a beloved elder who you knew either as a parent or a grandparent or a teacher or a coach or something, and you experienced them when they were at their, maybe not their full power, but at their middle-aged, a different kind of full power, and then to see that transition, I think anyone who's watched someone continue to fight right up to the end through a body that's decaying can relate. And obviously it's even more powerful when it's someone who has been a teacher or a coach or a parent or an uncle to the world through art that speaks to such a, could speak to you even though you'd never met him before.
Right. Although I want to make clear that, just in case people are thinking, that Chester Himes had Alzheimer's or dementia, he did not. And that's kind of like my point also, that his mind was as sharp as a tack.
Yeah.
But, his body betrayed him.
Yeah. I'm looking here at, I guess he suffered from Parkinson's disease.
Yeah.
Is there any book of his that you'd particularly recommend to people who wanted to begin their Chester Himes journey?
If he hollers, let him go.
From 1945.
I didn't know you were such a Chester Himes expert.
Well, I just have his Wikipedia up in front of me, and so
okay.
The world is his expert, and I'm just trying to fill in the blanks. I got my cheat sheet in front of me. I'm not going to claim. I would like to someday be able to be at least someone who's read a few of his books and can speak intelligently about him. But at this point, I can just give you just the facts, Jack.
Well, listen. I would also recommend the collected short stories of Chester Himes. Those are.
I imagine that includes the story that Tang from the Cosmic Slop series was based upon, because it looks like that's his only book of short stories.
Say it again.
In the series I was telling you about, Cosmic Slop, where they do, it's a Reginald Hudlin series. They had 3 episodes on HBO, and one of them was based upon a Chester Himes short story, and the episode was titled Tang, Tang, which is the name of the wife in this couple that has a shotgun delivered to their door, and we see the outcome of that. But yeah, people who are interested in that would probably find that story in the collected stories of Chester Himes.
Andras, when was that Hudlin production produced?
1994. Sorry, 1994.
Really?
Yeah, it's really. Well, we did a whole episode about it, and it'll be the episode that came right before this one, for people who are listening, and it is very, very powerful. And like Chameleon Street and like Dutchman, totally buried. HBO has a whole, like HBO Max has all their HBO stuff, but they don't have Cosmic Slop. And they also, in doing that research on that, we came across that HBO, which also produced The Trial of James Earl Ray with the King family, that also is not available on HBO's services. And it's like we're starting to see a trend here. Chameleon Street, Dutchman, Cosmic Slop, The Trial of James Earl Ray. What do all these four products have in common? I'm really there's a part of me that thinks I know what they have in common, but I actually am asking you.
Well, I've always said and thought that one of the best ways to find out what is being suppressed is to actually watch it. So, when people, I've always had, when people watch Chameleon Street, certainly Black people, I've never even had one question as to why has this film been suppressed?
Right.
Black people know immediately upon seeing Chameleon Street why it's been suppressed. It's only whites who have engaged me in that discussion of, well, do you really think it's being suppressed? I think it's probably has more to do with the trends of what's popular at the moment, and on and on and on. So many amazing moments in the last 30 years of fighting for Chameleon Street. In 2014, I had a phone conversation with the vice president of acquisitions at HBO. And he explained to me very seriously why HBO could not screen Chameleon Street because it was too old, that it was made in 1990 and HBO didn't show old movies. So that was such a bogus point to make that I still went through, and I had a list which I read to him of all the movies from the 90s, 80s, 70s, 60s that HBO was playing. But
he's like, no, I don't mean like old in terms of time. I mean old as a euphemism.
Well, when you were talking about HUAC, which of course it begins before 47, but it takes off in 47. But even in the early 40s, that whole communist baiting thing was beginning.
Oh yeah, I mean the Charlie Chaplin. That's the whole Charlie Chaplin story.
Exactly. Exactly.
We just did an episode talking about that, about how Chaplin, the case against Chaplin, formed the underpinnings for what would come later in the Red Scares of the 40s and 50s.
That's true. That's true. And also in the early 40s, I don't know if you're aware, but James Cagney and his brother William, they generated that entire Yankee Doodle Dandy project in order to prove to the whatever that pre-HUAC committee was, they were after Cagney, or at least they kind of put Cagney into a corner in the early 40s because Cagney in the late 30s had supported the, those 9 blacks, what was it, the Spotsville?
The Scottsboro Boys?
Yeah, right.
That was one of my grandfathers. He was one of the lawyers on that case.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
And what was his name?
Isaac Shmushkin.
Well, Cagney had contributed money to their defense.
Mm-hmm.
And
which meant that he was giving money to communists because communists were funding the defense. Were a big part of the defense. Yeah. You're telling sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. You're telling a very important part of history.
Well, anyway, that was it. Yeah.
And so you're saying that he and his brother created the I'm a Yankee Doodle Dandy project to prove that they were good, patriotic Americans.
They were exactly.
Got
it. Which they did brilliantly. But it's just funny that, not funny, but it's just interesting to see the timing of that. And then like 10 years later, the same thing kind of happened with Lucille Ball.
Yep.
But
yeah, and it makes you, going back to sort of the dynamics that created, it just creates this, like the idea of going after a Lucille Ball or a James Cagney isn't necessarily to destroy Lucille Ball or James Cagney. It's to get them to bend the knee.
That's right.
And then you have these very, very powerful icons who actually are, you can pull their strings. How to get them, make sure that Lucille Ball is never going to go on a TV show in front of all of America and make an important political statement in defense of something, in opposition to something like lynching or blacklisting.
That's the crux of the entire thing. And that's also the focus of my documentary and podcast, Yeshua versus Frankenstein in 3D. That is the crux of it. The controlling of the artist in Hollywood is where the real drama takes place. I've often thought that all the drama that is fabricated and concocted and cobbled together into movies, all of that drama, all of the Marvel all of that, Sturm and Drang,
yeah,
all of that is like empty cigarette smoke compared to the drama which entails controlling the artist. I went to school with Robin Williams, and when he committed suicide, well, it took about 2 years before the narrative could be changed definitively to, oh, well, Robin had this kind of disease and he was depressed. And the one thing that they never say is Robin was not in control of the content of his films. And that causes a very strong reaction in the soul of the artist who is being controlled. I'm not just talking about Robin Williams. I'm talking about everyone who works in Hollywood is controlled.
And this is the topic of the title of your podcast. When you sent it to me, it immediately got me so curious. And you just mentioned it. You just brought it into the conversation. Can you tell us more about that? Because is this a podcast you're in the middle of producing? Fill us in on some of the details of this project.
Yes, I am in production. And the subtitle of the work tells it all. The subtitle of Yeshua versus Frankenstein in 3D is How Teddy Adorno and his heathen Venetians used media to cancel the Christ, control the crowd, and color code the globe. Essentially, the subject matter is how media is absolutely the core of control used by the ruling elite since the Renaissance. You know, I say from Michelangelo to Michael Jackson, the color coding of Western civilization has been meticulously and very successfully carried out. I was talking to somebody a couple of weeks ago, and I was asking her if she had gone to Rome, and if she had gone to Rome, had she ever been to the Sistine Chapel? And she said, "Oh, yes." And I said, "Well, did you look up and see everything, of course, that Michelangelo painted?" And of course, she said, "Oh, yes." And I said, "And did you notice how God the Father and Adam and Eve and all of the disciples and saints and apostles, did you notice how they're all white? And all of the depictions of demons and devils are coal black? Did you notice that?" And she said, "Well, yeah, I never thought about that, but yeah, you're right." So,
yeah,
you know, that's what we're dealing with. We're dealing with the greatest artists in the world, and certainly Michelangelo would be in that category. They are under control to color code the content. From Michelangelo to Michael Jackson. You think Michael Jackson, oh Lordy. Make sure you listen to my podcast and watch the movie when it comes out. Because the issue that Michael Jackson dealt with, the color of his skin, is the same issue Michelangelo was dealing with when he was painting the Sistine Chapel. And you know, the Venetians invented bleach cream in the 1400s and began marketing it. And they're still doing it today. You, Andras, I take it that you've heard of bleach cream?
Well, yes, but maybe assume that the listener doesn't know. Could you tell us what bleach cream is?
Yeah, bleach cream is a very strong chemical that leaches out melanin, the color, so that if you are black or brown or yellow or red, you can take out the pigment by using this cream.
Why someone would want to do such a thing, speaks to the craziness to the wrongness of the world, and why we have a podcast called "The World Is Wrong."
Let's be specific. let's be specific. That's why I'm doing the documentary and the podcast, Andras.
Yes.
I mean, what it speaks to is a concerted effort to push and promote whiteness to the detriment and bleaching of blackness.
Boy, one item can speak to so much, because it's also like, if you made that bleach and then you forced people to put it on themselves, that would be one kind of horrific. But to make that bleach and convince people to purchase it, to pay you to put it on themselves, that's just a whole other level of horror.
That's right.
And I imagine that's what you're getting at.
There is also a G as in the word go. There's a G speak aspect to Yeshua versus Frankenstein in 3D. Do you know what G speak is?
I have no idea.
Okay, well, G speak, actually, you do have a very good idea. John Underkoffler, who I met face-to-face in 2009 at Sundance, when I went back there with Soderbergh. John Underkoffler invented G-Speak, which is like the ultimate cinematic editing package ever conceived. But you were, like me, first exposed to it during the movie Spielberg did with Tom Cruise. Why am I constantly blacking out on this movie's title? It starts with an M.
Minority Report?
Yes, right. Minority. You know the scene when Tom Cruise puts on the glove and then he starts moving images and audio around? Well, that is John Underkoffler. That's his invention. It's called G-Speak. G stands for gesture or gestural. Speak. G-Speak. Gesture speak. And he demonstrated for me his system, and it is just so incredible. And from both a editing and projection standpoint, it's the future. It's the someday, just like everybody now has a cell phone, someday everybody's going to have a G-Speak in their, I don't know, a G-Speak app or something that will give them access to what John Underkoffler has invented. But that's going to be, I only bring that up to let you know that it's a part of the distribution projection of the documentary, the movie, not the podcast, the movie of Yeshua versus Frankenstein.
When you say that, I imagine that that's the 3D aspect.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's all tied in. And that's never been done before. But you have an idea from the scene in Minority Report.
Yeah. And that is one of the most memorable scenes from that film. I think maybe there's something like, again, that's the synchronicity seeker in me. It's like when there are certain images that speak to us and we don't know why, that it's more like, oh, well, that's because that's part of the future. That is really part of the future. And so we're not just seeing it, we're recognizing it, the part of us that lives outside of time. Can I ask you one other question, just because of because you're producing the podcast? Is it an audio version of the film, or is it a deep dive discussion of the material that's in the film, or is it something else?
I would say the combination of both. And, what has always, the more I have been exploring the podcasting landscape, the more it seems to me to be extremely cinematic.
Yes.
The
best of it is, yes.
Right. Beginning in 2016, people started telling me, Wendell, you need to start doing a podcast. All you got to do is just talking to the mic. But podcasting, that's like saying that
the Mercury Theater is just people standing around a mic doing Shakespeare.
Right. I mean, there is a lot more to it than just me getting a Blue Yeti podcasting mic and talking.
I guess like the people who listen to this podcast must be like me in some level of saying, I want to hear and see this. Where are you at in the process of production on this? And how can we help?
Oh, well, you know how to pray for me.
I can do that. I can do that. Seriously, are you considering doing any kind of crowdfunding for this project? Are there ways that if there are people who are filmmakers in Michigan who are listening to this and are like, oh, I want to work on this project. How can I help? Do you need camera people? Do you need have you already shot this? Have you already recorded this? Is it in the writing stages? I'm sorry to press on this, but now you got me very inspired and hungry and selfish, actually. I want to hear it.
Yes, it's all been shot. It's all been shot. Yes, indeed it has. But, you ask about crowdfunding. Yes, there's no independent film without independent money, that's for sure. And in 2014, I enlisted the support of the Chameleon Street producer, Dan Lawton, and his wife, Heather. They helped me assemble a very well put together Kickstarter campaign for Yeshua versus Frankenstein, which, with Kickstarter, if you don't meet your goal, all the money that you did raise goes back to the investor. Yeah. We did not meet our goal, so that did not work out. And at the moment, I'm working with Arbelos Films on the production of a trailer, which we're going to be using for the Blu-ray release of Chameleon Street as part of the bonus features.
Well, then
we're editing.
We need to get. Oh, sorry. Go on. Keep talking.
No, I was just saying that we're editing that right now.
And that's the trailer for the documentary.
Exactly.
Got it. So I'm obviously very excited about this project, and I'm sure that the people who watch Chameleon Street, I think that's the big question for anyone who loves this film, is not just why wasn't there something more from this guy, but what else is there from this guy? So this is essentially the follow-up. You're going to be putting the trailer for the follow-up to Chameleon Street on the Blu-ray of Chameleon Street.
Yes, exactly. Exactly.
And that's just incredibly exciting. I've only been carrying this film around for a few years. Skinner Myers, who turned me on to it, he's been carrying it around for several more. You've obviously been carrying it around, and the people who were a part of that excitement at Sundance have been carrying this film around for decades. And the idea that there will be a next word from you as an artist is just very, very exciting.
Well, the funny thing is about what you're saying. The funny thing, not funny ha-ha, but funny ironic, I guess, is that this project is, I find it hard to even say this because people don't take you seriously when you really tell them that you've been working on a project for 25 plus years.
Oh, yeah.
But one thing I'll say is, Andras, this project, Yeshua versus Frankenstein in 3D, is pure dynamite. And believe you me, as soon as it is released, people are going to be fascinated because it's absolutely amazing what kind of power the media has to shape the minds of men, women, and children. Malcolm X, before he died, a couple of years before he died, Malcolm X said that the media is the most powerful entity on the planet Earth.
Yeah.
That the media has the power to make heroes of villains and villains of heroes. And that is at the core of the concern of Yeshua versus Frankenstein in 3D. And I will take you up on your offer.
I'm sure there are many people, although there are huge forces that would like to not see that message reach the people who want to hear it. I think that there are many people, also a majority of the people, who are hungry for something like this. And I don't doubt it at all. I talk with people all the time who, because of the kind of dynamics you're talking about, find themselves perfectly positioned to really devote themselves to a masterpiece that takes decades. I'm not saying that yours will be that masterpiece, but we have to work in the realm of, we have to be put in the place where we have to work in the realm of all we can do is make the masterpiece, paint our Sistine Chapel, or unpaint our Sistine Chapel, as it were. And I totally, you're on that trajectory, and I'm very happy to be having this conversation with you because, as we started, the story that I was told was about an artist who was stopped. And it's really great to talk to that artist and find that he is anything but stopped.
Right. And part of the story of Yeshua versus Frankenstein in 3D is an incisive examination of the Roswell incident of 1947. I took 3 film crews to Roswell between 1997 and the year 2000. And I have amazing footage, talking head footage of the various individuals who were actually involved with the Roswell incident, hired by the Pentagon to produce and put it over. And that footage is extremely compelling. And then we also interviewed all of the leading ufologists like Stanton Friedman and Michael Hesseman and Linda Moulton Howe and Yeshua versus Frankenstein in 3D points out that the same use of media to sell racism for 400 years in America is the same media used to sell aliens between 1947 and 2022.
This just gets better and better. Ufology, that's definitely a third rail territory. And I think whereas the commercial impulse is to avoid third rails, the artistic impulse is to charge directly at them. So, like I said, this just gets more and more interesting. The more you don't leave out of your narrative that is left out of most narratives, it just makes it that more compelling.
Yeah.
I'm so excited to see this. I'm also sitting on I know we've been talking for a while here, so I don't want to tax your time, but I did.
Oh, well, by the way,
yeah.
By the way, there's one point that we sloughed over in the beginning and never got back to, but in your outline that you emailed to me, you mentioned this, and I wanted you to know that I've been waiting for somebody to bring this up for 30, 32, 33 years. I've been waiting since I put it in the movie. I've been waiting. And you're the first one. If I could give you an award, I would send you a bottle of Dom Perignon, because I have waited for someone to ask me why Chameleon Street begins with an audio word, quote, now, unquote. And you are the first one to ask. So,
well, yes, please tell us.
Well, I'll just say that the voice you hear saying the word now is the voice of John Gielgud. And that one word was lifted from his acting the role of Hamlet, Act 5, Scene 2, which is when Hamlet is talking to Horatio about the special providence in the fall of a sparrow. And he says, if it be now, 'tis not to come, and if it be not to come, it will be now. That's the now that was taken. It will be now. That now was taken from John Gielgud's Hamlet. And since I had not paid Cademan Records or anybody, I was so paranoid about people recognizing that it was John Gielgud. You know, we had to pay like, what, $7,000 for 14 seconds of Jean Cocteau's Beauty and the Beast.
Mm-hmm.
You have to pay for all that stuff. And I was so paranoid when I put Now by John Gielgud in there, and we hadn't notified anybody. I said, hey, to the sound guy, hey, fiddle around with the treble and the bass and change it around a little bit. And so he did that. And ever since, I don't know why it is, but when I listen to that now, it doesn't sound as much like John Gielgud as it does Wendell Harris for some reason.
Yeah. And I want to point out that when you did the reading, when you gave the now what my old acting coach Morgan Shepherd used to call the positive ambiguity. He was a Royal Shakespeare guy, and so came up at around the same time as Gielgud. And when you said the now, it wasn't now, it was now. It was
Right.
And that is the
Right.
quality of that now in the phrasing, and that's part of what makes it so sort of wonderfully disorienting, because it's not a now, it's a now, and then you see this is based upon the life of Douglas Street, the language that shows up on the screen, and then we're into the movie. And
Exactly.
yeah, it's
Yeah.
as an art. Well, I'm very happy to have found that Easter egg and be the one who's asking you about it. And I also know, as an artist who puts things like that in my own work, how frustrating it is to wait for that. So I hope that eventually I'll get some of that myself. There's where people figure out the little tricks I put into the albums I've made, or the things I put out there. I have a bunch of other little, like, just sort of nerdy questions about Chameleon Street. Do you mind if we just sort of, like, you don't feel like you have to, you can even say, I don't even want to answer that one, but I just have several. Do you mind if I ask you them, and we can see if we can get through some of the nerdy things I wonder about this film?
Let's see if we can get through.
Okay. So Chameleon Street seems to share DNA with two Woody Allen films, Zelig and Take the Money and Run. And there's even a scene where Street is going in to see Cocteau's Beauty and the Beast, and in the other side of the frame there's a mural with Woody Allen in it. And I'm just wondering, I mean, he was such a sort of a cultural mainstay in the 80s at this time where you're developing as an artist. Were you at all aware of that shared DNA between your film and his?
Well, let me say that in 1990, when reviews of Chameleon Street began coming out, Lord knows that, many of them were constantly bringing up Zelig. In fact, and that was especially true in Europe. All of the Italian and German reviews, some of the titles even of the reviews, a black Zelig, the black Zelig. Wendell Harris is the black Zelig. That was brought up quite a bit. And Andras, I am always, extremely forthcoming about various influences that came into play during the entire process and gestation of Chameleon Street. And I don't have any problem with sharing, any of the information regarding the creative process. I must say that, and what year did Zelig come out? It was late 80s.
I think it was 83. I think I actually made it in my notes here somewhere. 1983.
Yeah, because I had definitely seen it, while assembling Chameleon Street. And Zelig never really came to my mind as anything that was, utilized in. I mean, I liked the film very much. I was very impressed with it, in terms of what he had achieved with all the combining and compositing of images. But I'm just trying to say that it was not like a major player of inspiration for Chameleon Street.
Got it. Although I'm not surprised that that reviewers made that connection, and I actually was wondering. I had that in my mind, that phrase. I'm embarrassed, but Black Zelig was like, I was curious. Was this ever pitched as that? Was that ever in the conversation? So, like I said, we're just going to move through these because I have several questions. There's another question I have.
Wait, hold on 1 second. Andras, what are you talking about when you said that there was some connection between Beauty and the Beast and a Woody Allen poster?
Oh, yeah. In that shot where where Doug Street is going in to see Cocteau's Beauty and the Beast and speaking about it in voiceover, to the right, there's a mural that has like 3 or 4 famous people in it. And the one that's closest to the wall is Woody Allen's face, I'm pretty sure.
But it's a mural, not a poster, right?
Yeah, it's just a mural. Yeah.
Yeah, right. Okay. Right. Okay. Gotcha.
But, I'm we'll get to it in another question, but maybe I'll just jump to that. So I'm very interested in synchronicities in film. And one of the wild synchronicities for me in this film is Willie Horton. So you are making a film about Douglas Street, and he has this extortion scheme against the baseball player Willie Horton. And that is played for what it's played for in the film. But then the film comes out, and just a couple years later, George Bush uses a totally different Willie Horton in what is now used in colleges as a textbook example of dog whistle racism to win the presidential election. Maybe I'm getting my time wrong. I guess what I'm curious about is that when I watch the film, whenever you talk about Willie Horton, there's this buzzer going off about George Bush. And I'm wondering if that happened after the film or before the film. And again, now I'm really questioning my timeline. How do you relate to that? Like, when you hear Willie Horton, what do you think? And did that change from when you were writing the film to when it came out to now?
No, not when writing it. And only after the film was made did the connection to the other Willie Horton occur to me. But it was not part of the film's gestation. And interestingly enough, if something else had been put into the film that was almost added, I dare say you wouldn't even be asking that question, because I had, in 1988, as the film was being edited, and it took a year to edit, and I always tell people, well, not always, but sometimes I tell people, just to give them perspective, it took 4 months to edit Gone with the Wind. It took 11 months to edit Chameleon Street. Of course, with Gone with the Wind, they had 4 editors working.
But you can see this is a very excitingly edited film, sonically as well as visually.
Well, I'm glad to hear you say that. What did not get put into the film, but almost did, but the only reason I didn't put it in the film is I did not want to take 2 to 3 months trying to get the rights to it. But now keep in mind, Andras, this is 1988, and there was a beautiful, exciting, socially or the in term now is social justice, but it was politically very astute. A wonderful 8 to 14 second clip of O.J. Simpson making a comment. And brother, that clip almost made it into the film. The only thing that stopped me was I didn't have the time to try to get the rights. And I thank God in heaven that clip did not get in because there's no way you can put a clip of OJ in anything without it taking over the entire thing. I mean,
yeah.
And I don't know if you remember or not, or if you can remember. People seem to have totally forgotten, but not black people. Black people remember. In 1988, the love and admiration for O.J. Simpson was extremely strong.
Mm-hmm.
By everybody, whites and blacks.
Absolutely.
So it never even occurred to me that it might be superseded by, a double murder 5 years later. But anyway, I thank God that we didn't put that clip in.
And yet, and this is where I'm getting back to the synchronicity of the Willie Horton thing, this is just something that I think is true of the art of film, because it is, as the opening line is, it captures the now whenever you're making it. And I feel like it opens up an aperture on reality that brings in things that the artist could never have intended, because you're going to be seeing that now against a different now every time it comes out. And so that attracts a kind of synchronicity. And I'm just curious for you, as the Willie Horton story developed while you're in the production of this film, was there, I don't know, when I have synchronicities while I'm creating a work of art, it sort of spurs me on, even if they're kind of scary or ugly synchronicities, but the fact that sort of the art is speaking back to me in a way that I couldn't control because of events in the world. And I'm just kind of curious, did you have any of that experience while this story developed in the world, while you were developing your own story?
No, Andras. My main concern.
Yeah, I'm just crazy. I get it. That's me.
My main concern during that period of time when we were dealing with Willie Horton, the baseball player, my main concern was having our legal department contact the Horton family so that we would not have any problem with the Horton family, the Willie Horton Detroit Tiger.
The baseball star, yes.
Exactly.
Got it.
So that's where that focus was. And as you might imagine, there are a million details to be commandeered during the making of a production.
Oh, yeah.
And, success or failure is going to be determined by how you dealt with those details, whether delegated or not. And the detail of the Willie Horton that you're talking about was not part of my concern at that part, or that point.
Got it. Well, then let's keep moving on. The film has many Michigan celebrities. The Barber Brothers, Paula McGee, Detroit Mayor Coleman Young. Those are the ones that I saw while I was watching the film. But are there more, and maybe more obscure and interesting, Michigan celebrities that you got into this film that you like to direct viewers' attention to?
Only one. There's a quick clip of my father, Dr. Wendell B. Harris Sr., in the flash cut of the, when Street is in the cell of Smooth, about to be approached sexually by Smooth, and he's watching TV, and he's changing the channels on the TV, and at one point you see a kickboxing clip, and my father is in that clip watching the kickboxing bout. That's the only thing. There were so many almost rans, would have ran, like the Masquerade Ball, which you have not asked about, and I don't necessarily want to get into it, but the Masquerade Ball was an ordeal from beginning to end, for 3 years as I was writing it, and while we were producing it over a 3-day period. The Masquerade Ball was a monster, and it was made a monster mainly because we could not get a group to play for the Masquerade Ball.
Well, that's my question about the Masquerade Ball. Is Fatima Studex a real band?
That band was made up. That title was made up for the film, but a band did occur at the Masquerade Ball that Street did attend. A band was there, but they were not named Phantomus Judex. But the people that we wanted to get for Phantomus Judex were Thompson twins were approached. Till Tuesday was approached.
Oh, man, that would have been so great. Amy Mann and John Bryan in 1980. Oh, my goodness.
Yeah. Till Tuesday and Thompson twins, eventually, after negotiation, they essentially turned us down. Patrice Rushen we approached, and the one that I had thought we had secured, George Clinton. And at the last minute, like a week or even less than a week before George Clinton was supposed to show up, his people called up demanding that we send $10,000 immediately to George Clinton, or he wouldn't be showing up. And then he wanted another 5,000 when he got to Flint. Anyway, that was not the deal that we had set upon. And whatever monetary requests George Clinton made, or his people, his reps, we could not at that exact moment provide them with that money. And so they said, okay, well, we're out of here. And then we had to get a replacement. But my point is that every time we talked to somebody, whether it was Till Tuesday or Patrice Rushen or George Clinton or Thompson twins, every time I would rewrite the script to accommodate the group and the song that we'd be using from that group. And that became such an ordeal because, like 5 times I had to totally rewrite the script. And ultimately, we used Dimitri Muganis, a punk rocker out of Manhattan, who was a close friend of the producer, Dan Lawton. And Dan called up Dimitri like at the last minute, and he agreed to fly in and do it. And we were so grateful, because for some reason, the musicians, securing musicians for the group Phantomus Judex in the Masquerade Ball scene was almost, or probably as hard as finding a female actor to play Gabrielle.
Wow. Well, somewhere out there, Amy Mann's kicking herself. That's all I'm saying. She should have been. That would have been amazing. That would have been amazing. Okay, I got to ask you about another, but there's one actor in this film who really stood out to me, and I watched them and I just thought, have I seen them anyplace else before? I feel like I have, but maybe it's just I'm hooking into some alternate reality in which they went on to become the next Molly Ringwald. The actress who played Melissa, Paula McGee's haiku spouting secretary, who catches Street's spelling error. She is so compelling to me in that just that one little scene she has. And then at the end, she's featured several times in the telling of the frog and the scorpion story. Can you tell me about this actress?
Her name is Colette Haywood, and I'm very glad you brought her up, because I meant to bring her up. Yeah, in telling you that long story about all the people that we contacted, it was right before, actually, I offered it to Attila Shabazz, that I want you to know, if Colette Haywood had said yes, Colette Haywood would have been playing Gabrielle, because I offered the role to Colette like in mid-1987, because it was obvious to me after I auditioned her that Colette would be a wonderful Gabrielle. And the only reason that she said no is I forget where Colette was going to school. It was one of the black schools, Meharry or Fisk or Tuskegee. She was going to some school, and she had to get back, and she refused to play Gabrielle. But I was so impressed with her that I demanded that she play Melissa, and that we put her into the Scorpion and Frog epilogue. Because I'll tell you something I've never told anybody, even Colette, but Andras, there's a lot of talk about, directors having a certain rapport with a certain actor that is kind of beyond the rapport experienced by the general run-of-the-mill actors that one is working with. Run-of-the-mill, I don't mean average. I mean all the actors that one directs, you have to connect with. And you have to find some language between the two of you. But once in a while, you find an actor that you are in such simpatico relations, you can almost think what you want, and they do it. It's almost telepathic. Joseph von Sternberg talks about that with Marlene Dietrich.
Mm-hmm.
There have been all kinds of wonderful relationships between certain directors and certain actors. And I never had that until working with Colette. And I also put together, and it's going to be included on the Blu-ray in the bonus features, I put together 4-minute talking head collage of Colette called Colette Vignette, which actually won a Sony Prize, because I could be directing Colette, and all I would have to do is think what I wanted her to do next, and she would do it. It was just amazing. And, you know, you and I both know that Angela Leslie is absolutely stunning as Gabrielle. Well, once in a while, Angela should send Colette Haywood a thank you note, because if Colette has said yes, Angela would not have been cast. I would have cast Colette in March of '87 if she had accepted the role.
Yeah, the road not taken, because yeah, she has. I guess you can feel that. Maybe you feel that relationship in the way it's shot. But she's a very compelling actress. And is it possible that I saw her in anything else besides this that isn't listed on IMDb? Did she go on to a career in acting, or did she continue acting in any way?
No, she has published books of poetry, I know, but I have not actually been in contact with Colette for 20 years now. But she did not follow that path. And as I had mentioned to you before, or maybe I didn't, but Angela Leslie had been in several feature films prior to Chameleon Street. She had been in Collision Course with Jay Leno and a couple other features. But after Chameleon Street came out, and I should make this very clear because I shared this with you the other day.
Yeah.
I mentioned that, you know, Bill Cosby had destroyed her career. But I should also mention that Angela is the one that got away. You know, all of the others actually ended up being raped or ravished by Cosby, but Angela got away. But Bill Cosby was so vindictive that he destroyed people, whether he actually succeeded in sleeping with them or not. And he went out of his way to destroy Angela's career. And as I mentioned to you yesterday, Andras, a career in acting on film for blacks or whites is a very delicate proposition. And it's easy to get derailed.
Yep.
Especially by someone with the power and pull and reach of Bill Cosby.
Yeah. Yeah. If there are more details you want to share, I'm sure this is a place to share them. And if you'd prefer not to, I don't really feel comfortable prodding.
Well, it's up to you. You can go and Google Angela Leslie and Bill Cosby yourself and get all kinds of information. And you intimated yesterday that you might be contacting her. If you do contact her, that's fine. If you don't, that's fine. But whatever you want for your show. But I just wanted you to know that although he destroyed her career, he did not actually rape her. She got away from him. And that's what triggered his angry response as far as impeding her career.
Yeah, no, it's what you say about how delicate an acting career is, because it really, like, as as someone who's an actor and also is what I would consider a creative artist, and I think there difference, because I think of acting as being an interpretive art, which means that you need to have someone create the thing and put you in it in order for you to be able to do your art. And that is a very different thing than being a writer or a painter or a musician who can go into that I'm building a masterpiece space. So yeah, I will be reaching out to Angela. I especially because now that we've discussed her here, I'd love to hear. I feel like it's only right to get her voice on this.
Just in continuing to expose and reveal the Black image as portrayed for the last 100 years in American cinema. I don't know if I told you this or not, but between 2004 and 2012, I received from Hollywood studios, well, 3 were major Hollywood studios and 1 was an independent filmmaker. During that span of time, Andras, I received offers of appearing in 4 films. And each of these non-related projects, I mean, these were all different studios, different production companies, different times between 2004 and 2012. All of them, all of the roles that I was offered in those 4 films were pedophile roles. And the concerted effort to get Wendell Harris up on the screen as a pedophile has,
yeah.
Chameleon Street presents something that they would love to either suppress or denigrate.
Yeah. That sucks.
Tell me, how many pedophile roles have you been offered lately?
I don't think I've been offered any pedophile roles. I mean, I've been a little bit maybe too vocal in my support for Woody Allen, so some people have leveled that charge at me for, but short of that, no. But you did appear in one film that I think of as a great film, Steven Soderbergh's Out of Sight, and you did not play a pedophile in that. You played a cop. How did that come about?
That came about because of 2 words: Steven Soderbergh. And let's see, that was Steven had played a part for me in the film that I've been working on for 25 years. Steven had filmed that footage in Detroit, and that was in September of 1998, around there. Anyway, Steven, in my documentary, Yeshua versus Frankenstein in 3D, Steven plays Theodore Adorno in the recreated Adorno documentarian scenes. And it was while we were shooting his scenes as Adorno that he mentioned Out of Sight, which was going to start shooting the next month in first Miami, then LA, then back to Detroit. So anyway, that's how that came about. And just so you know, Uh, Stephen has been a great supporter of Chameleon Street and Wendell B. Harris Jr. And Stephen is responsible, along with Armand White, of beating the other judges into giving the grand jury prize to Chameleon Street in January of 1990. I was told that Stephen and Armand had baseball bats, and they threatened the other judges. No, I'm just joking.
Someday am I going to be interviewing a director who's like, we should have won at Sundance, but Steven Soderbergh threatened me with a baseball bat. Wendell Harris thinks he was suppressed. I was suppressed.
Right. Oh gosh. That reminded me of something. You sounded like Ian Richardson as Marat in Marat Sade just then.
Oh my, so funny. That's my acting coach. My old acting coach, Morgan Shepherd, was in the original production of that, and I heard so many stories about that when I was a young actor.
The original production in England?
Yeah, the Royal Shakespeare, the Peter Brook production.
Who is this?
Morgan Shepherd. He's no longer with us, sadly. W. Morgan Shepherd. He, what would you know him from? He played the punk rock character Blank Reg in the Max Headroom series. He was in The Elephant Man as one of, like, not a character. He's a character actor. He was in...
I remember Max Headroom.
Yeah, he's the old punk rocker. Right.
He was your teacher?
Yeah, my acting coach from when I was very young.
In England?
In the United States. He came to America to do Max Headroom, and I was like, well, I got to be in your class. And then we became friends, and we're friends right up till the last weeks of his life. Not that we became not friends. Last time I saw him was in like a month before he died, and I still miss him terribly. But he was a very, very special actor and a great teacher to a lot of people. I guess the last big question I have for you, and I think it's kind of fun, maybe this is the use of the scorpion and the frog and the scorpion story at the end of your film, because as far as I can tell, the only time before Chameleon Street that showed up was in the Orson Welles film, Mr. Arkadin. Arkadin? How do you pronounce that? Arkadin. Thank you. See, there's my lazy American voice taking out the opportunity to relax around the big ah sound. Arkadin. As far as I can tell, your use of that story is the first use of that story in film since the Welles film. But since Chameleon Street, it has gotten to the point where it'll show up. It's shown up in so many other films. And now if it shows up in a TV show, like I was recently watching and it showed up on a TV show, and I was like, come on. Do we need to hear this story? That's just lazy writing. Now if it's almost become cliche, but at the time when you used it, I think it was the first use since Welles. So I was curious if you were aware. Were you referencing the Welles film? What was the inspiration for you to put that story at the end of your film? And have you noticed that it has been used a lot since then?
Well, let me say that I've been aware of the story since I was 11 years old, and I first read about that story being the end of Mr. Arkadin. So I was very aware of it since I was a child, and very aware that Orson had used it. But it seemed at the time to be extremely appropriate, so I added it into the ending. And One of the things about Chameleon Street that certain decisions were made, and not to soft pedal Doug's character, but I will say that two changes were added to make him perhaps more palatable. Number one, Doug has a great adoration and respect for German film. And if we had stayed true to that, Doug would have ended up speaking German and using German. And I wanted to try to put a romantic edge onto Doug's character. And speaking German did not seem to actually help that. The last thing I thought we needed was to add a German, the violence of Germany's language to Street's character and all the baggage that Germany carries.
And just French lends itself to a different kind of pretension that really works in those scenes.
Exactly. And so that was a definite change that, yes, I did make. I made him love French film, which he liked, but if I had stayed true to Doug's passion level, I think he had more passion for German film than French. So I changed that to French, his passion. And then we added the frog scorpion story at the end, also in a sense to make him more palatable in attempting to give some more explanation beside his own actions to the essence of his character, the core of his character.
Do you think that Douglas Street would be aware of the Wells quote, or is that you as the director being aware of the Wells quote?
It's funny because I do think that when I first began interviewing Doug in 1985, I do think that I mentioned to him about the frog and the scorpion. We had quite a bit of talk about film, quite a bit. And, I said to Doug near the end of our relationship that his method of dealing with people is always basically the same. He bonds with you. He bonds with you by glomming onto your main interest. He forms a relationship built supposedly on a reflected passion of whatever your passion is. So, for me, he sized me up immediately that cinema was my passion. And so over a 3-year period, Andras, he essentially, like a chameleon, he became a filmmaker. He was constantly talking to me about how he was working on a script of Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, and that he wanted to make that and direct that into a feature film. And he literally became a filmmaker for the 3 years that we worked together. And that is, as he has often confessed, That is the modus operandi. Or is it modus operandi?
I've heard the I pronunciation, but I never trust unless someone's sure, and I'm not. So, but let's go with operandi.
Either one. You have both recordings.
Yes, that's all there.
Right. So you can make me sound less ignorant with your editing.
I don't think that's necessary. I think part of intelligence is being willing to be unsure. So,
hey, listen. Here's the deal about that, and it's funny you would say that because it's been on my mind the last couple months. Because look, here it is now. At the age of 67, I've spent a lifetime acquiring quote unquote knowledge, reading books, reading. The more that I learn, the more I understand that I know nothing. And that is the amazing paradox of knowledge. The more you learn, the more you know, man, you don't know nothing.
Yeah. Well, I believe that's called wisdom. You you get enough knowledge, and you apply intelligence to it, which is just experience and context, and then eventually it leads to wisdom, which is just, I don't know. The more I know that I don't know. Which again is part of what makes me so excited about your next project. And it also leaves me curious about something else, because again, projecting my own story onto you, when I had my Hollywood experience, and I'm speaking to you from Hollywood right now.
Right.
But you can be in the geography of Hollywood and not be in the machinery of Hollywood.
Right.
But my experience when I physically left Hollywood for the first time, I went back to the town that I grew up in, Olympia, Washington, to take care of some family business. And then I ended up just remaining there, sometimes being very frustrated with it, sometimes drawing a great deal of inspiration and just maybe some sense of safety from it. And you are calling me we're speaking with you in Flint, Michigan. And I'd love to hear what your relationship is with that place and how it's sustained you as an artist.
Well, that's a very good question, because Flint is so amazing. And what is really amazing is everybody in Flint that we approached for assistance in producing Chameleon Street, everybody in Flint just bent over backwards to assist us in every way possible. That's why I say to you, when you spend $1.5 million of investors' money and everybody in Michigan bends over backwards to help you, and then you produce the film, it is lauded by Sundance and critics all over the world, and then is almost immediately suppressed in distribution. What do you say to all those people in Flint and in Michigan who bent over backwards, and nobody gets married in order to have a divorce, and no filmmaker makes a film in order to have it suppressed and put on a shelf? So,
yeah. So I gather from what you're saying that the investors, did they ever make their money back?
Yeah, The investors the 5 white investors who invested $95,000, they made their money back. The $225,000 from black investors, they made their money back. My brother Hobart, who put in $120,000, and my mother and father, who have since died, and who invested $585,000, they were only paid back like $200,000 before they died. So the Harris family at the moment is still out approximately $400,000 to $500,000. And I've said this before also. Yeah, I don't know. You may want to cut it out ultimately, but I'll say it anyway because I think it proves the point. It explains the power of Hollywood distribution and what happens when you have it, what happens when you don't. There's a movie called Weekend at Bernie's, which came out around the same time Chameleon Street came out. Weekend at Bernie's received Hollywood distribution. Chameleon Street did not. Now, for the last 30 years, Andras, I have conducted a personal Wendell Harris Chameleon Street poll all over the world. I ask people all over the world, have you ever heard of Weekend at Bernie's? I've never, ever, in 30 years, heard anybody say no to that question. Everybody I ask has heard of Weekend at Bernie's. I ask those same people, have you ever heard of Chameleon Street? Andras, I have never yet, in 30 years, heard anybody say, oh yeah, I heard of Chameleon Street. Even in Flint, Michigan, if I walk down the street or anywhere in Flint and ask, have you heard of Chameleon Street? They'll say no. And I say all that to say that Hollywood distribution is more than ubiquitous. It is, I don't know, what's the word? It is.
It's fundamental, like in the hierarchy of needs. It is, it's like oxygen. You either have it and you can breathe and exist, or you don't have it and it's, as you say, it's hard to exist. The world, what you're describing is an example of the world being wrong. A world in which everyone, including me, who has never seen Weekend at Bernie's and is really uninterested in it, is aware of it, and am hungry for films like Chameleon Street, and didn't hear about it until I heard about it from a friend, which is not this at all, which is happening outside of distribution channels. So yeah. Well, this is why we have this podcast and what we're trying to address. And I think maybe if we could go out on, I don't know, paying it forward, backwards, and all around, are there films that you think that the world is wrong about in a similar way? Like films that have meant a lot to you, but that have been denied distribution to the majority of the film-going world?
Well, yeah, that's a good point. And once in a while I make it. I'm glad you brought that up because, I'm always talking about the suppression of Chameleon Street as if, I don't know, maybe I give the impression sometimes that Chameleon Street is the only film that has been suppressed. And of course, that is not true. There have been quite a few films that have been suppressed. Although I would also quickly say that Chameleon Street has received more suppression than most suppressed films. I was just thinking as you were talking about a 1970, I don't know, 3 or 4. The film that George C. Scott made immediately after Patton, maybe it was 72, it was called Rage.
Oh, yes. I'm familiar with this film.
Have you seen it?
I have. I recently saw it. It is something.
You know, that film came out 72 or 73. That thing was suppressed for 30, 40 years. And just recently, it's been, you know, kind of coming back. So, I mean, there are all kinds of films that get all kinds of suppression. But the one that I would quickly bring up is the film that was directed by Anthony Harvey in 1967. It's called Dutchman, starring Al Freeman Jr. and Shirley Knight, written by Leroy Jones at the time, who a few years later became Imamu Amiri Baraka. But that film, I would say, has been suppressed in the same manner, with the same thoroughness as Chameleon Street. And once you see it, you'll understand why. Just like, you know, once you see Chameleon Street, I mean, hey, let's go out on this. Let's go out on this. Andras, you tell me. You tell me. I sound like Monty Clift in Judgment at Nuremberg. You tell me.
Great. One of my favorite films.
Yeah, me too. You tell me why Chameleon Street has been suppressed on global broadcast television from 1994 until this moment. You tell me, as Monty said.
Well, I'm just going to go with the first thing that comes to mind. And I think it's what I was talking about when I watch it. And I imagine that the way that Douglas Street conducts himself in his interactions with power is the way that you conducted yourself in your interactions with power. But as I'm thinking about it, what I'm revealing is the projection that I think probably that Hollywood power brokers, who are, you know, I'm assuming mostly white, at least at the highest levels of where the money was coming from, almost maybe exclusively white.
Right.
That's the projection, that there is something in Douglas Street's character and your portrayal of him that is so, and this is what I enjoy about it, is just so disdainful and arrogant and it's something we didn't even get into, but the way that he has mastered so many of the trappings of white culture, not even just in the way in his portray, becoming a doctor, but that he's wearing the Bauhaus shirt and he's talking about Cocteau, and he doesn't wear his blackness in any way that you could say, oh, well, this is his, oh, of course he listens to this kind of music, or he dresses this kind of way, or he talks this. There's none of those. There's no stereotypes. In fact, it seems like they're withdrawn from it. And so the combination of all of that, I think, must be incredibly intimidating. And then I think also once the crime is done, then you have to commit to it. Once you've suppressed something, you have to keep suppressing it, or you have to acknowledge why it was suppressed in the first place. So
I hear what you're saying. I agree with all of it. I laugh only at the last part because, frankly, the people who are controlling content in Hollywood, and they don't even live in Hollywood. The people who could control Hollywood don't live in Hollywood.
No way.
But I'm laughing because I think they could care less about that last comment you made regarding
having to admit,
gee, we've been lynching black people for 40 years, 100 years, or whatever. We better keep on lynching them because I don't think they care.
Yeah, I mean, you're saying what I'm suggesting as the symptom you're saying is actually the disease, or maybe it's the other way around. But yes.
Well, yeah, right. Exactly. Yeah. Exactly.
Well, when we did our initial podcast about Chameleon Street, since then the film has gotten a re-release. I've seen it being discussed. I've seen you doing interviews all over the place. And now we hear that there's another project that's in the works. So even though selfishly for myself, and I'm sure for you, it would be great if you could have made as many films as Steven Soderbergh has made since 1990. At the same time, here we are. And this film is being, I think it's going to be a case where as you do your survey of Weekend at Bernie's and Chameleon Street around the world, in the next 10 years, many more people who care about film are going to know that Chameleon Street exists and have the opportunity to see it. And I think that is a profoundly positive and good thing, especially if it means that we get to see the next one from you.
I agree with you totally, and I appreciate your commentary and your conclusion, my friend.
Radio 8-Ball.
Andras here. When I'm not co-hosting The World is Wrong podcast, I'm hosting and producing the Radio 8-Ball podcast, where we answer questions by picking songs at random, like picking musical tarot cards. We've hosted musical divinations for people like John C. Reilly, Patricia Arquette, Tig Notaro, and Fred Armisen, and hosted over 200 songwriters, providing the randomly chosen answers from Inara George and Dan Byrne to Mose Allison and Alan Toussaint. That's Radio 8-Ball, all one word. You can find us wherever you get your podcasts and download our app from the iTunes App Store.
Hi, everybody. Sorry to interrupt this show that you're probably enjoying, but I'm comedian Kevin Dombrowski, who you probably don't know. Joined weekly by my producer, Adam, a little bit more well-known than me, Hineker. Say hi, Adam.
True, he's got a point.
Dial it back. Each episode, I'll sit down with a very famous comedian that you probably do know, and if they're not famous, you probably know them anyway, and we'll break down what's happening in the world by making fun of all of it. This is Just Joking on the Paper House Network. No interviews, no arguments, just jokes. Now, back to your show that you were already enjoying.
Dear listener, if you are just discovering our podcast, you can find all of our episodes on our website at theworldiswrongpodcast.com. You can also write to us at contact@theworldiswrongpodcast.com or follow us on Instagram at theworldiswrongpodcast. And now, back to the show.
Yeah. Oh man, now that long but great. It's
long and great.
Long and great. But just his voice, it's just like the fact that he met Orson Welles at a bookstore. I can't imagine what it would be like to be like the person in line behind him. Just like those booming deep voices talking about who knows what for probably a longer than they needed to while people are waiting in line. To
That
buy a book
will be $5.75.
Just man, that's such a great combo of voices. Like if only James Earl Jones would also show up, and the three of them with their beautiful voices.
You know who also has a strangely low voice is Seth Green. He would be like,
does he?
Yeah, yeah. He has a.
You don't get that from his acting.
Yeah, he really lives down here. It's yeah.
Interesting.
You don't notice it. It's because
I've never noticed that
because he's a wiry little redhead.
Yeah.
You don't think of him as having like a Tom Waits inside of that body, but it's in there. Talk about what were the highlights for you? Because I have so many highlights from this, but everyone's just listening to me talk. So.
The whole thing, just because he's just a filmmaker that you've never really heard much from or about. So like, it's all exciting. It's all new to me because I've never seen him interviewed, other than recently, and they didn't interview him for 3.5 hours like you did. So like him going out to try to write for Mary Hartman, that's amazing. That's amazing. They fucked up on not hiring him for that because who knows what.
Oh my God.
Magic.
Yeah.
What magic could have that? Like him teaming up with Norman Lee or whatever. Like, wow. Like what would a young version of him have brought to that show? That's a great. Negropolis sounds amazing.
Yeah. That script exists. That script exists, and I don't know why you couldn't make it today.
I want to read that, and everyone should just pull their money and make that someone that should get that movie made.
Yeah,
because it sounds like a more just like hot button racial version of like History of the World Part 1 or something. Like just it sounds like it has that absurdist humor, but more stuff to be said. And that sounds fantastic.
Yeah.
And then his Weekend at Bernie's test is pretty good. I think that should be for any movie to see. If you want to see, if you're a filmmaker and you want to test it, I think because even now, even in 2022, I think there's still people that know what Weekend at Bernie's is, just because it's just such a known thing. Like even people have never seen it.
I think that gets into a different
part of the
test.
language.
I think his test is about that they both came out around the same time. I think
you can do about any movie. Yeah. You could do Weekend at Bernie's and Touch
Citizen
of Evil,
Kane,
and more people would say Weekend at Bernie's.
Yeah, probably. Sadly,
no, that was good. That was a good, and it's good to know that it wasn't as the story isn't as sad as we assumed it was. That it wasn't like he made this movie, because I think in my mind he made this great movie, put everything into it, and Hollywood shut their doors on him, and then he just was like sad in Michigan for 30 years and being unknown. But it's good to know that at least he, got to try to do the Hollywood thing of a few years of writing stuff and it's frustrating.
Yeah.
But it is cool. It is cool that like there was,
there was action.
Something.
He had an adventure.
He had an adventure. It didn't.
Yeah.
Not a total bummer. Like I don't know. Maybe he looks at it differently, but it doesn't seem like it. It seems like he doesn't regret that little part of his life.
Yeah, and he has definite. I think that he's devoted himself to another work, but at the same time, I didn't get the impression that he was. I felt. I'll tell you something. I felt a little bit bad about. I felt like I was trying to make it too positive. Like I was trying to be like, no, but come on, man. Like I was talking to a friend. Like, oh, come on, it's not so bad. But it's still what happened to him in his film was pretty bad. But we're looking at it now from a place where it's out there. So it's for me, it's easy for it to see it as a happy story.
But he doesn't come across as like the stereotypical like bitter filmmaker that felt like they were owed something and they didn't get it.
No,
like it's nice to think that he's, and the fact that he's making these new things that just sound very thrilling and interesting and totally bonkers and different than anything that anyone else is trying to do, like his podcast and his new movie. I hope they both get completed.
Well, I'm going to do whatever I can to encourage and support that project. And if we know more about it, we'll announce it on the show and let people know if there's like any sort of crowdfunding campaigns they can support, or when it comes out, when they can go and subscribe to it and share it with their friends.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, let's not let this go on too long because it's already, who knows, once I put all the clips in here, it'll probably be like a 5-hour episode.
Oh, my Lord.
No, it's not going to be a 5-hour episode. Yeah. But I don't know, it could creep to 4 if we keep talking, which I'm still doing and I don't know why. Okay, well, coming up next week, we are going to be looking at a film by two of our favorite film artists, Jane Campion and Nicole Kidman, In the Cut. Who else is in? I haven't seen this film yet, Brian. I'm looking forward to it. Who else is in it?
Meg Ryan, Mark Ruffalo. Yeah, it's good stuff.
I always think Mark Ruffalo's name is really funny.
Why? Because it sounds like the potato chip Ruffles?
No, it's just it sounds like
Buffalo.
Yeah, well, it sounds like a weird sort of verb. Like he's like I'm gonna ruffle. Like it's like I'm gonna ruffle off to Buffalo kind of thing. Like
I'm sure he's heard it all.
I'm not trying to make fun of his name. It just always sounds funny to me. For a long time I had a hard time remembering it because he's such a cool guy and his name is. It makes me giggle. Sorry, giggle and snort. Giggle and snort. Is there a lot? Is that what I get? Is In the Cut a very funny movie?
Not at all.
Oh.
It is very not a funny movie. It is an erotic thriller. You know, like it's Jane Campion, so it's it's more than that even. So even to describe it doesn't really work.
So it's like High Anxiety, a neurotic thriller,
and erotic thriller.
An erotic thriller.
Yeah.
Might make you feel neurotic depending upon your relationship to your body and other bodies. Exactly. Okay. And have you seen Power of the Dog? Have you seen her sure to be Academy Award nominated latest masterpiece?
Not yet. It's on the short list. I'm working my way through catching up on 2021 stuff. So hopefully maybe by the time this episode is out, I'll have seen it.
Are you worried that something bad happens to the dog? Because let me tell you, it kind of is. Something bad does happen to the dog. You know what happens to it?
No, don't tell me.
Didn't even get cast in the movie.
What? It's just a title only?
There's no dog. There's no dog.
Oh, just like Reservoir Dogs. What a ripoff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I felt the same way about the Shaggy DA.
No, there is a dog in that.
No,
one.
There's no real DA in it though.
Oh yeah. True. Just somebody pretending.
Yeah. I don't trust that. I don't trust that dog to litigate anything.
They should make a sequel where it's a dog who turns into a DA and like just have it be like a season of The Wire or something. Just have it be like some courtroom politics. Just dealing with stuff in the city.
And you can expect hijinks like this when we dig into that crazy comedy In the Cut from that hilarious master of yucks,
Jane Campion.
Jane Campion.
Yep.
No, we shouldn't be. I'm making fun because I haven't seen it. Once I've seen it, I'll be appalled by everything I've said. It's so much easier to mock or to make fun from a place of total ignorance. And just remember that, folks, and it'll serve you well. Other things you should remember is that you can find us at www.theworldiswrongpodcast.com. Every one of our episodes has a page devoted, or every one of the films we cover has a page devoted to it. This episode will actually be living on the Chameleon Street page with our Chameleon Street episode. And if you have questions, comments, queries, thoughts, interrogations, please address them to us at contact@theworldiswrongpodcast.com. If you'd like to look at some pretty pictures, you can find us at The World Is Wrong Podcast on Instagram. And if you want to see some insightful japes and jabs, come find us on Twitter at World Is Wrong Pod. And there's not a lot of japing or jabbing, and I don't know how pretty the pictures are. I mean, they're little cartoons of us bopping up and down. But if you like what you see there, let us know, because we're insecure and we're not afraid to admit it. So I guess we're not as insecure as we claim to be. So we're liars. Anyway, with all of that said, thank you for bearing with us for this very long episode. And I hope that it was nothing to bear at all, that it was as great a joy to listen to as it was certainly for me to participate in. I feel quite blessed. So, Brian, you ready to get out of here?
I'm ready.
Okay, well, then it falls to me to remind you folks that wherever you are, the world is wrong. And it's probably wrong about you.
Hi, I'm Brian.
And I'm AJ.
And we have a podcast called The Director's Wall,
examining a filmmaker's career, film by film. First up was M. Night Shyamalan, then Francis Ford Coppola. Who's next? Is there anything to this whole auteur theory? Find out on
The Director's Wall.
Subscribe via Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, or your preferred listening platform.
I am looking, frankly, I need to get assistance with people who know how to do, add music and all the effects and all the things that make it cinematic.
Well, if you, as you get those materials together, that is what I do. So I'd be very excited to explore ways we could work together.
Well, I will definitely take you up on that. But let me ask you a quick question regarding podcasting. Because have you heard of a guy who works out of Detroit named Tim White? He has a podcast.
You mean Mike White?
Mike White, yeah.
The projection booth, yes.
I have spoken to Mike a couple of times, and both times I asked him a very simple question. How do you monetize podcasting? And he told me that he has never really been able to do anything significant in terms of monetizing podcasting. In fact, I think a couple of months ago, he told me in answer to, once again, me asking him how much money he's making, I think he is making enough money to actually produce the podcast, but that's it. So, and then he went out of his way to tell me that he has not made any significant money from all the podcasts. And as you must know, since you're familiar with him, the guy has been accumulating, I don't know how many.
Oh, no, his is one of the best film podcasts out there. I've been on his show. We've been on his show. And yeah, I know how hard that's what makes his show great, is that he's not doing it for the money, because he'll read multiple versions of scripts. He goes and reads the source material. He's phenomenal. Sometimes he annoys me too, because I disagree with him, but on different things. But that's part of being what makes him exciting as a reviewer. He has his point of view, and sometimes I disagree with it. But no, the tough thing about film podcasts is that there are people like Mike who make great ones, but it's a pretty saturated field. And I don't know, I could give you a list of other what I consider to be successful film podcasts, like the Pure Cinema podcast. They have the New Beverly Theater and Quentin Tarantino sort of as a umbrella to support what they're doing, but I don't imagine that they're making much money off it either. I think a lot of what it is, and this is how I approach podcasting, is first of all, it's something that I enjoy, and also it's promotion and building up the other things that I do. So the podcast lends value to the film, but I don't want to say there are people who monetize this doing podcasting. It's a pretty simple numbers calculation. If you have upwards of 10,000 downloads per episode, you can start making money off of ads. But what you may find is what you just find as a filmmaker. If you're the kind of person who's doing really interesting work, it's hard to get to those 10,000 people. If you wanted to do an episode, if you wanted to make a podcast about designer sunglasses, you could probably get to 10,000 people and monetized, and sponsorships a lot faster than if you, and that's America, or maybe the whole world. I don't know, but it's definitely America. But the simple answer to your question is, if you can get to the point where you are getting 10,000 downloads per episode, it doesn't matter what your content is. You can find people who will start to pay you money. And then it's just when that becomes 1 million, those same companies are paying you more to advertise on your show than when you were at 10,000, because they're doing ad buys all around. That's why if you listen to like This American Life or some very big, high budget, high profile podcast, they'll have similar ads that if you're listening to a very, like some sports podcast that's very local and maybe very niche, it's because that company, Squarespace, is buying ads on This American Life all the way down to the lowly 10,000 downloads a show things. And you just tap, there's an algorithm. And if your episode does 25,000, then you're going to get a higher ad buy. So that's the simple answer.
Yeah, but the one thing that your answer doesn't seem to answer is, why is it that Mike White is not making money hand over fist? I mean, look here.
I know.
I just quickly, glanced over his shows, not even all of them, just a few of them. The first thing I said to him was, do you actually have Nicholas Rogue on tape talking? He said, oh, yes. And all of those people. Oh, okay. You know about him. You've heard about him. You know his work. You say he's one of the best. And so you're telling me also that one of the best with one of the most prolific registers of shows can't make any money because it's a film podcast. Is that what you're saying?
Well, no, I'm not saying that, because you can look at Karina Longworth, who does the You Must Remember This podcast.
Right.
And it looks to me, and she does several ad reads in every show. And, and she's featured in, I think they did a Vanity Fair feature on her. She's managed to make it into something that looks like it's a moneymaker. And I have to think maybe it's, I think I'm more like Mike White than like Karina Longworth. And I'm just going to bet that he spends way more time reading and researching the films that he talks about than figuring out how to brand his show and seek out advertisers. And it's sort of a self-fulfilling thing. Like if I was the manager for Mike White, I would be encouraging him to find a way to hire someone who just thinks about that, or convince someone who just loves his podcast the way you and I obviously do and see it as a resource. Someone who would, on spec, just who's really excited about branding and advertising, bring that skill to it. And I believe that if someone worked for his show for 6 months doing that, I think he probably, he'd be annoying because then he'd have all these ad reads in his show, and it would, one of the things I love about his show is that he doesn't. I wouldn't begrudge him if he did, but I bet he could make money off that show if he was able to hire someone or find someone who could focus on that aspect, because I just don't get the sense that that's something he is going to ever prioritize.
Yeah.
He's going to be seeking he's going to be trying to find Nicholas Rogue, It's hard to track that guy down, and then to be able to do the research that he does, so he comes to those interviews not sounding like a dummy, and really not just to Nicholas Roeg, but to you and I as a listener. Like, if we're listening to that, we already know a bunch of stuff. So if he's not bringing something new to the table, I'm going to tune out. And he always does. So, yeah, he's great. I bet he'd love to hear us having this conversation. I'm recording this, by the way. I may just send it to him. Because
go on.
He should know how much he's appreciated.
Definitely. Definitely so.
Yeah. Did you like his... I will cut this out if you say no. But did you like his episode about Chameleon Street?
Well, stop recording, please.
Yeah, I didn't like it either. Okay.